Hi all, appreciate that people will be logging in, so I'll just give a brief introduction, just a huge welcome to the Performance Football Coaching webinar. A real global audience this morning, so we appreciate your efforts to join us. My name is Tom Hounsell, I'm the Programme Director for the suite of football coaching programmes here at St Mary's University, and we're really excited to be able to bring to life our online distance learning Masters programme in Performance Football Coaching. The purpose of this event is to attempt to provide a brief insight into some of the indicative content and, crucially, some of the practitioners and academics that both deliver and contribute to the wider programme. The format for this morning will be to work through our sort of programme modules in numerical order in terms of module code, and you'll realise that there's a real variety in different types of presentations, some that are more formal, others which are more conversational. But we'll do our best to stick to the specific time slots, but we're really keen to make sure that we probe our guests for as much detail as possible. And you'll notice there's a Q&A function, so please feel free to pose any questions during presentations. And if there's time, the St Mary's member of staff will attempt to pose these to our guests sort of immediately after their presentation, but inevitably we may not be able to get through sort of any or all of these at the time. And as such, we've sort of split the lineup into two halves. And I'm sure you'll agree we have real depth in the lineup today, so definitely worth sort of sticking with us. As such, there'll be sort of two group question and answer slots to pick up any remaining questions. So without any further delay, I'd like to welcome lecturer in physical education and sports coaching, Claire Morvenna.
Hi, so I'm Claire. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the expertise and skill acquisition in football module that we run. This module provides a critical understanding of the science that underpins effective learning and the development of expertise in football. But the really important thing is that we apply everything that we do. So we introduce you to the theory within this module, but then it's all about how you can apply this within your coaching practice. So the focus is on introducing theory, but also investigating the way this can be applied within your coaching practice. Now, this is reflected in the assessment that we do. So within this module, the assessment is a group coach education session, and it's also a critical reflection on your own coaching practice. So, and you'll hopefully see this throughout the whole programme, but really the key thing is to underpin everything that we do and for you to take home the theory and apply that within your own coaching practice. Now, to give a little bit of an insight on this subject, we're going to welcome Dr. Chris Pocock, who studied for his PhD at St Mary's University and who is currently a lecturer in sport and exercise psychology at Kingston University. While his PhD focused on analysing the role of effective and contextual constraints on place kicking in rugby union, today he's going to be talking about his work on visual exploratory activity in elite academy football. So without further ado, it's over to you, Chris.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. Let me just share my screen quickly. Okay, yeah, thank you for the introduction, Claire. As Claire said, I did my PhD at St Mary's, working closely with the Expert Performance and Skill Acquisition Research Group. I think my project, that was actually my master's project as well, ties in quite nicely to that. So talking around theories within skill acquisition, but how it applied to an intervention that I delivered within a football academy throughout a season, looking at visual exploratory activity. So what is visual exploratory activity, or VEA? There's a number of different terms that you might give to it, so things like scanning or searching, but essentially it's defined as movements of the body or the head that are directed away from the ball. So usually this is seen as looking for information around the player. So looking for opponents, looking for teammates, looking for space, essentially anything that is looking away from the ball in order to plan or anticipate what is coming next. So as I said, anecdotally, we kind of see this as a key skill, and those of us that obviously watch high-level football or involved with high-level football see this as really important to seeing the next step or seeing the picture around you, or the best players are always seen as having the best vision or knowing the next step ahead. And this was supported by some of the early work by Gerry, and he analysed all the Premier League midfielders. So I'm not sure if any of you remember, but during the 2000s, there was this thing called player cam. He looked at all the player cams throughout the 2000s in the Premier League, and he showed that the players with the highest pass accuracy, or the players that were most successful with the ball, they were the one that explored most frequently. And actually, in terms of comparing the actual players, he found that the two players that explored the most frequently within that whole sample throughout the whole period of time were Steven Gerrard and Frank Lampard. So arguably two of the best midfielders at the time, and showed that they had the highest number of kind of scans or VEA. So what I'm really interested in is terms of, obviously we know football is a very dynamic sport, ever-changing environmental cues, I said earlier, ever-changing kind of spaces and teammates and opponents, formations around players. And therefore that changes the affordances for players. So affordances are opportunities for action. And in every unfolding moment, there's always a different decision or there's a different affordance available for an athlete. So essentially it ties into this coupling between perception and action. So how can we train perception, or how can we develop perception within athletes, or how can we enable that to emerge in order to inform those actions or those decisions? It's not necessarily a new skill, but I'm kind of talking around this perceptual skill. We kind of all use it every day. So whether we're negotiating traffic and driving, we're always looking around, looking for information. But it's really looking at how do we calibrate that to decisions, and also can we get players to scan more? And if so, would that then lead to better decision making? So I've just got a very short video just to kind of illustrate what I mean by this VEA, or what I mean by this scanning. I just want you to focus on the Chelsea number 8, so Frank Lampard, and I just want you to look at the sheer number of head movements or body movements that he makes away from the ball. Constantly looking around before receiving the ball, constantly looking for space. And then once releasing the ball, he's then looking again, looking for space again. So I just want to play that first few seconds again. Constantly looking for teammates, looking for opponents. And that in those few seconds, he's probably moved his head 10, 12, 13 times. So this might be a conscious or unconscious skill within athletes, but it's something that's certainly very important. And as such, as it's kind of seen as very important anecdotally, and as it's seen very important in kind of performance analysis in terms of attributing it to pass accuracy, I wanted to look at it in academy level. So as I said, this is a project at Professional Football Clubs Academy. I wanted to look at, can we increase VEA? So can we increase the number of scans that players are making using an intervention during a season? Also, is it linked to higher performance with the ball? So if a player will scan more, or if a certain player scans more than another, is that linked to better performance with the ball? Is that linked to better decision making? And lastly, I really wanted to look at it in different positions. So a lot of your day's work looked at basically centre midfielders, but I wanted to look at how did that differ between kind of central and wide positions as well. So in order to do that, I used 5 academy players throughout a season. So they were all kind of on the verge of getting their first professional contract. The reason I chose 5 was mainly in conversations with the coach, and I wanted to look at just midfielders and forwards. And obviously I wanted to use the players that were playing the most in order to have the most data in terms of performance analysis. I drew on a lot of sports psychology research and worked closely with sports psychologists at the club, and worked closely with the performance analysts at the club. And we used this imagery intervention in which we use video clips, a bit like the Frank Lampard one we showed. So you have video clips of kind of players like that, or also the actual player that we were focusing on in their own games. And then imagery scripts, usually used on a Friday afternoon before a game, in order basically just to get them to think about it a bit more. So get them to kind of think about when and where to scan, how often they might scan, and trying to bring it to a bit more, I guess, fruition within the games. So in order to do this, we then looked at different situations on the ball. And in order to analyse performance, we wanted to look at scans per second and action completion rate. So essentially passing completion rate, but also obviously players might choose to dribble or might choose to shoot. So essentially action completion rate was their intended action successful? Decision making as well. So obviously fairly subjective, but we used that based on previous research. And usually players would score a 4 in the middle of the scale, middle of the 1 to 7 scale, if they kind of did the decision that was expected of them. They were scoring kind of 6s and 7s if they did a penetrating action, if they did a through ball, and then 1s or 2s perhaps if they gave the ball away unnecessarily. So obviously I've only got a fairly short amount of time. I'm more than happy to kind of send anyone by email some of these results in more detail, but I just want to give a kind of flavour of some of the results that I found throughout this season. So I'm going to use an example participant of a centre midfielder. So I've got two figures here. So the figure on the left is their VEA, or the visual exploratory activity, their scans per second. The game number is essentially throughout the season, how many games they had. And the first 5 weeks is where I kind of just monitored that, just analysed their performance. The intervention was then introduced between weeks 6 and 11. And then obviously we wanted to look in the last few games of the season, did they retain that skill, or did they retain any improvements, perhaps based on the intervention? So as you can see on the figure on the left, it's obviously fairly variable depending on opponents, depending on kind of situations we looked at. But those trend lines, those horizontal lines, show that the intervention was successful in improving the VEA, and also then improved even further after the actual intervention. And this then correlated to improvements in action completion rate, so especially in those last few games. Whilst there might be other kind of factors within that, there's a kind of clear correlation between the two. And we found that visual exploratory activity and action completion rate improved in central positions. Decision-making marginally improved as well. So this was kind of indicative of the two central midfielders that we looked at. Wide midfielders was a little bit of a different story. So a little bit more variable, not so much improvements, and also the scans weren't as high, or the VEA wasn't as high as central positions. And then therefore there wasn't necessarily same improvements in terms of action completion rate as well. So I guess this kind of project, and whilst there was kind of a bit more to it as well, it really opened up my, or the research area, to think about the quality of scans as well as quantity. So initially when I approached the research project, I just thought, yes, if we can increase the amount of scans, increase the amount of activity, if they're constantly looking around like the Lampard clip, they're ultimately going to perform better decisions. But now I've started to think about what are kind of quality scans, what are the information that players might pick up from. And this then leads into my kind of future research, and those of you that are obviously interested in this area, I think there's real scope to kind of take this on, especially if you're kind of a performance analyst, or you work within clubs, or you want to work within a club. There's real scope for coaches to think about how they can design practice environments. So obviously I come at it from a kind of sports psychologist point of view, but now I think there's more kind of scope in terms of how can you manipulate constraints, how can you design perhaps small-sided games, how can coaches design practice to kind of facilitate that scanning. There's been more research in the last couple of years looking at kind of coach perception, so how important a coach sees it, and usually the higher the kind of the level the players are at, the more importance that a coach puts on it for a player. As I said, think about more detail. So obviously I looked at kind of quantity and how many scans they were making, but now it's kind of thinking about when and where to scan. So when are the players scanning, and where are they, what are they looking for? And I know something that is covered on the module at St Mary's, and something that Dr. Andrew Rocker is quite interested in, is that notion of creativity. So how do players calibrate information that they pick up from around them? How do they calibrate that to creative actions? And as I said, I really wanted to open this up and kind of say this was kind of one of my master's projects, and I think there's real scope for opportunities for future research. So those of you that work in performance analysts, obviously coaches, sports psychologists, I think this is a real area that is obviously important to football, but also there's a lot more that we can know about it as well. So more than happy to share kind of the couple of papers that I referred to there, or sharing a little bit more detail for you to read through in your own time. But just want to thank you for your time. Hopefully you found some of it useful. More than happy to answer any emails or kind of DMs, or obviously answer any questions now. But yeah, thank you for your time. I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
That's great. Thanks very much for that, Chris. Just a couple of questions. Do you think that the coaches that you were involved with and that you were kind of working with, do you think they were aware of this as a trainable skill before you approached them and kind of did some of the research?
Yeah, so that's obviously something that we spoke to within the coaches. They were interested to start with, but I think this is where then the researchers come in, is working with the coaches and kind of saying, okay, this is what kind of research suggests, and then learning from the coaches' kind of experiential knowledge as well, learning from their kind of environments. And I think that's where applied research comes in. It's kind of learning from how do they perceive that skill, okay, what the kind of research suggests, and then it's, okay, let's work together. How can we kind of develop it further? But yeah, there was always a conversation that coaches saw it as a developing skill, especially at kind of academy level. It would be interesting to see what coaches thought about players who were kind of in their peak or in their 20s, whether you thought you could develop it more. But yeah, at an academy level, they were always quite keen, and they always stressed how important this skill was.
Yeah. Just as well, you kind of off the back of that, you spoke about how you took a real interdisciplinary approach. So you spoke to and you worked with performance analysts, psychologists, as well as the coaches. Do you think that's another crucial thing, sort of both for researchers, but also for coaches, is to make sure they're using the wealth of information that's available to them for something like this?
Yeah, 100%. I think in any kind of applied research projects, obviously, clubs have all different staff now, and they all have expertise, and it's working with them. So instead of trying to do everything yourself, it's kind of, how can we take the knowledge from performance analysts? How can we take the knowledge from sports psychologists, biomechanists, coaches as well, and kind of draw that all into a research project together? So yeah, I was really lucky to obviously work with the performance analysts who did the clips for me, who did the analysis. I then looked at the scans myself, and obviously the sports psychologist helped in the kind of delivering of the imagery as well. But yeah, 100%. I think that's the real skill of research, is working with those different teams or working with the jewels, because that's how you're going to get such applied research and really get some interdisciplinary knowledge as well.
Brilliant. Just some questions have come in on the Q&A, so I'll ask them.
Okay.
Tom asks, what category academy were the participants from? And was the project undertaken with a higher or lower academy? And do you think that was significant in terms of the results that came in?
So I think at the time, obviously it was a couple of years ago, at the time they were definitely Cat 1. And I think this project, and hopefully what I was trying to illuminate, that this can be applied to kind of all levels. If you have the ability to kind of use performance analysts and use video clips, or kind of an individual player cam, I think it's possible to certainly deliver some sort of interventions around that. The imagery scripts are fairly kind of personalised and working with players. And as I kind of opened up, people that are watching this or coaches that are watching this might think, okay, it's interesting, but I'll work on it a different way, or I'll design a practice environment a different way. And I don't think the category of academy is necessarily important. I think it helps, but I think what I try to show is that, okay, this is what I did, and people might want to pick it up and use it in their own academies or in their own kind of environments, or even obviously beyond football as well in different sports.
Brilliant. One more question from the Q&A, and then we'll try and pick the rest up later on if that's okay. So there's a question coming from Chris, who says, are you aware of any correlation between lower scanning players and league position? So is it that it would sort of go wider than just that player's performance, and is it something that we can relate to the performance of the team?
Yeah, great question. I think that's not necessarily something that I'm aware of, but this is what I mean by kind of there's scope to look at further projects. So obviously the kind of stuff that I referenced was just looking at Premier League, but I think there's definitely scope, obviously without kind of thinking about it too much, definitely scope to kind of look at, okay, how does it differ between countries? How does it differ between levels? Is there different levels in terms of scanning? Does that relate to performance? And that might give us a bit of an idea about how important it is as well. As I said, I'm kind of really new to this. This is a kind of really new research area, and trying to kind of capitalize on performance analysis. But yeah, this is what I mean by I think there's scope to look at, okay, how does it differ from perhaps Premier League and Championship, Premier League and League One? How does it differ between English and Spanish leagues, English and Italian leagues? I think there's real scope within that, if you have access to the footage, to kind of do these types of research projects. And I think it will give us more of an idea of how important scanning is and how it kind of informs performance with the ball as well.
Brilliant, that's great. I know we've got quite a few more questions coming through on the Q&A, so what we'll do is we'll just keep those questions and then we'll run through them kind of in the break between at the end of the sessions, if that's okay. So that was really great, so thank you very much, Chris, and I'll hand back to Tom.
Thanks a lot, Claire. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Claire. Really good an overview of a research project there, so hopefully inspirational for some of our master's students who are about to undertake their own projects. So thank you for sharing. Up next is actually a module that I oversee, so PFC 7002, which is Contemporary Approaches to Player Development. And this module draws upon different models and theories for coaches to synthesize in relation to their experiences as practitioners. The module draws upon different domains of coaching specific to player development and the main disciplinary perspectives, so behavioural, cognitive, social, to help make sense of your coaching context and to develop your knowledge and understanding of coaching for player development. And it's with great pleasure to welcome both my friends and colleagues at Fulham FC, Head of Coaching Ben Bartlett. I suppose if I'm Scottie Pippen, makes him the Michael Jordan, under 15s and under 16s coach, Andrew Joslin. A last dance reference for you guys there, just slightly topical. I think everyone's been chaining that. So over to you, Ben.
Morning, guys. Thanks for having us. Jos, are you okay to share the screen, please?
Absolutely. You got that, Ben?
Thank you. Yeah, so well, the intention is that we'll share some context. Jos and Tom will certainly get into some of the context about why they coach the way that they coach with the under-15s. And I guess the key message for anybody that is coaching or involved in player development that's watching is just, why do you coach the way that you do? Certainly no intention to say that anything that Fulham or the staff that have been there for a number of years or are currently there are doing is right, but it is just perhaps a way to think about coaching that maybe will promote and encourage some thought in yourselves. So this video will play out, and then I'll seek to talk through it and then allow Tom and Jos to kind of articulate a bit more of a contextual experience of the work that they've done with their under-15s over the last season. So at the top, vision focused, values driven. So from a coaching perspective, what you're aiming for, vision at Fulham is about individuals that will fulfil their potential. So what you're aiming at. So question to you guys would be, what's your aim? What is it that you're focusing towards with the players? And how do you ensure that absolutely everything that you commit to, every single training session that you do, every behaviour that you exhibit is aligned as much as possible with your intended vision? Also, that's underpinned by values. Fulham's stated values are what would be called the 3 H's: honesty, humility, and hard work. So in pursuit of that vision, be mindful of the way in which you embody those values to ensure that you're not sacrificing certain things in pursuit of your vision. I guess the game is probably for players. So in the same way, coaches' behaviour probably needs as much as possible to be responding to those players. And I guess the historical kind of top-down arbitrary syllabus that says when you're under 16, you will learn these things. The under-18s programme will include those things, whilst probably well-intended, is perhaps not necessarily helpful in ensuring that the players are at the centre of their game. I guess similarly, it's probably important to ensure that we have some kind of loose territory that coaches can navigate whilst deciding how it is to support the players. Fulham's kind of enduring philosophical elements are in front of you. On the left, I guess the kind of player-focused player profiles, if you want for a better term, would be about impact, which is how do you put the individual at the centre of the work that you do. On the right-hand side is what Fulham call the 5 moments of the game, but principally that is just the laws of football, what things underpin the way that people move when they're playing the game of football. And at the top, what Fulham call class, which is very much just a Fulham example of, I guess, the historical FA approach to the four-corner development. How do you consider the whole person in the way that you approach their development? There are 5 questions on there that we would ask coaches to consider in the way that they plan, A, for a season, B, for a session, and C, hopefully more importantly, across a whole player development journey. You can read them, but I will read them out to you just to try and give you a little bit of context about why those things might be important. And we start with the player. What is it that we know about the young men that are in our care? And how does this inform the ways that we coach and learn with them? And probably some subtleties, but perhaps importance of the language there. They are young men. They are in our care. And we are coaching and learning with them, not coaching and learning to them. It's a reciprocal process. That player development and coach development needs to be entrenched together, not separate, and that whilst the players are learning, the things that they're learning are very much aligned to the things that the coaches are focusing on and attending to at the same time. As you move across, then consider the game that those players will be playing. So how do we intend to align our understanding of the players that are in our care with a particular playing style or system? Some coaches at our club and elsewhere would probably have quite a rigid system and style. No suggestion that that's good or bad, it's just an approach. Others will perhaps have more of a flexible, perhaps a range of different systems and some great flex in the way that they approach the style. And at the top, to what environments will we expose the players and our style to support learning, and recognising that if we have a training session on a Tuesday night when it's cold, the environment is different than when we play in a European tournament, perhaps in Portugal in June when the weather's hot. You play games that come thick and fast, perhaps against opposition that you haven't experienced playing against a lot previously. Fulham as a club, and I guess football and sport as an industry, are becoming more and more data focused. So the final question is, how will we measure the impact? And measure isn't only about data, it's just really about saying at the beginning of a particular journey, we thought we understood these things about the players. we said we were committing to play football in a particular style, and we understood that some of the environments that those players were going to be exposed to might be like this. How will we measure whether or not the experiences that the players got across the game of football within the environments they were exposed to has supported their learning and development? And the central part, before I hand over to Tom and Jos, is that's where the design piece sits. In the same way that we would hope that players will decide the best thing to do on the pitch based upon the ever-changing environment that they're being exposed to, we ask the same of coaches, decide how to coach to support learning. And this is a relatively loose territory that we ask coaches to explore to inform the way that they think about supporting the players' development. I'll hand over to Tom and to Jos and hopefully contextualise some of that a little bit more related to a particular group of players.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks to Tom and St Mary's for the invitation. Just want to go on record as sort of detracting myself from the Jordan-Pippin relationship and obviously it is a bit more Bassett and Dodds from England football manager. Moving on, so obviously you can see this. You should see now sort of an under-15s objective for this season and into next season, into 2020. Obviously, myself and Tom work with the current under-15s age group, and I also work within the under-16, so split between two age groups really. So I guess ultimately what you're seeing here is an 18-month to 2-year plan, and I'll go through a little bit of detail in a second around some of the processes that you see on screen. I think it's important just to reference really that the relationship that me and Tom have from a professional point of view extends nearly around 10 years now. And I think that's critical into the way that, one, we go about our work. It just allows for good coherency in relation to our way of thinking, and also, I guess, how we support each other. That's not to suggest that any relationships that are less than 10 years are less meaningful, but I do think that probably allows for good understanding of, what we bring to the coaching group and also how we support players and staff within that. It may look quite wordy and structured, but as Ben alluded to, I think there is certainly some flexibility in the plan, and probably what allows for flexibility is just our ability to reflect on the plan whilst the season is going. So you'll see on sort of the second row, there's some key timelines there that I sort of put in when I was designing this, and obviously those milestones are fairly significant in the football season, and certainly with the age groups that we work in. But also within that, there's obviously session to session reflection, game to game, week to week. So ultimately, we want to try and follow some of the processes that are on this page that you see, but there also needs to be some clear reflections going on whilst we're in this season or in this process. I think without further ado, it's important that I reference some of Julian North's work, 2016, on his elements that have been taken from this, from components of effective development systems in performance pathways, and there's also some similar work probably been developed by the FA as well. I think big question when I was putting this together really is, typically when we plan for a group of individuals or seasons, especially within academy settings, we typically look at a season in itself. So we'll adopt a group of players that come up from the age group, and then for one season we'll put potentially a group of targets or a season plan in place just for that one season. But I think we're moving to a position at the club now where we want to try and take a bit more of a longer term view on player development. So I guess in our context, it would be, can we stitch players' journeys up through the phases? So when they leave the foundation phase, they may have similar targets and some consistency from foundation phase into the YDP and then through into the professional development phase. And I guess there may be some suggestion that this might help players have a longer term perspective around their development and their targets. So as you see, the plan, as I said, is a 2-year plan, hopefully encapsulates some of the work that the multidisciplinary team will have with the group over not just one season, but 2. And hopefully, again, this can lend itself into, where their journeys go into the PDP phase. I think it's probably also important to note that with this current group of players that the plan is devised, I work with the group, 1 in the foundation phase and 2 at under 14. So my understanding of the group is quite good, I would think. And I think it's important to understand, that sort of level of handover that has come prior, which will enable us to be informed about what needs to come next. I'll just run through sort of the timelines and sort of the key goals within that. So obviously there's a chronological timeline, as I've explained. So just looking to review per se each sort of key milestone, so pre-season, Christmas, and so on. And then there was some outcome goals really that we felt was quite pertinent to the under 15 age group. There's a couple in there that involve competition football. So under 15 games program is quite unique. A lot of the boys play up in the 16s. Some Sunday fixtures aren't fulfilled, so we feel that the club, there's a good opportunity for the boys to maybe learn about how to play in competition football. We obviously wanted all players to play a good heap of minutes for obvious reasons. And again, looking at the previous season, we have quite a lot of front players in the group, and we felt that maybe the chance creation could have been slightly improved on from the season before that. In terms of performance model, so there's obviously what you'll see there is it says class, as Ben alluded to in the previous slide, character, learner, ability, speed, and success. Essentially, that's the FA four-corner model, just used in some Fulham language. And then underneath that, to try and feed into those performance goals, really, are just some of the day-to-day and week-to-week processes that were agreed between staff across disciplines. So, for example, trying to, for character, for example, trying to have exclusive sessions that have specific character outcomes, as well as trying to support players within those cup competitions to be able to deal with perceived pressure. I'm going to try and link myself into Tom now. So I think we're just going to give one example of potentially how some of the planning has played out within some of the game context. I think it's really, really interesting to see also that this sort of objective we have for the group and for the team is also shared across departments. So an example of this would be Ben has supported us in terms of the coach development work that he's done, and it's been very much in line with some of the goals of the players and the staff, and that comes right back down to this. So that even the support that we're getting from Ben is all linked back to the overarching goals of the group, which you see on screen here. And I think that potentially allows for, again, greater coherency in terms of where we're trying to move to. Without further ado, Tom, I'll pass over to you.
Okay, thanks. I'll just talk over the top of this video, and apologies if it's slightly laggy, but it just provides an example. So I'll sort of attempt to bring to life one specific aspect of the plan, and as such, we'll just focus on the learner component. But it's really important to stress these aren't distinct dichotomies. One component informs the other, and as such, there's huge overlap between individual components within the plan. And this perhaps just provides some insight into how functionally this plays out within a particular part of the season. And as Ben and Jos have mentioned, this is primarily driven by the perceived needs of the particular players. And as such, we espoused that we wanted tactically flexible players to be able to change between systems and strategies within games. Critically, this should perhaps maybe also include players recognising sort of when, why, and how, and thinking about the game. But Amy's on later, so she can answer all of your metacognition questions. But it's important to note that we move between a 4-3-3 and a 3-box-3 in this example, but there are other systems to suit different individuals throughout the season. So, for example, playing with two up front in a 3-5-2 more recently. But some of the reasons behind these formations link more broadly to playing style. So simply put, to control the game, we as a club and a set of coaches believe we want to dominate possession and counter-press quickly and effectively. So not to say that this is right or wrong, but it's broadly something we ask our players to commit to. And sort of each formation just brings about certain affordances, both for units and individuals, such as, centre-backs moving between playing as a 2 or a 3, defending against a 1 or a 2, playing out on opposite or strong side against variations of pressing strategies, opportunity to defend sort of the half space more or less easily by managing sort of the numbers and distances between defenders within the unit. And I suppose in midfield, a possible numerical advantage. We have quite a high number of midfield players, and we're also committed to achieving an average of 2,500 minutes for each player. So obviously playing more with a formation that has more midfielders will support that. But we also know that the majority of the opposition we play against play with the three in midfield, and this numerical advantage also allows us to potentially possess the ball more centrally to narrow the opposition for potentially feeding our wide players, which I suppose also links more broadly to our conversion rate target and how we considered the way in which we may score goals as a consequence of the strengths of our front players and their individual targets. So I suppose in principle, this also might allow our midfielders to take more touches of the ball and be able to practice targets around receiving and releasing in different areas of the pitch and under different levels of pressure. A part of this, as sort of alluded to, is allowing for some flex in the plan to allow for, I suppose, one, the open, complex nature of the game, and then two, the sort of the ever-changing world of youth academy football and sort of all of the possible factors that might influence the way in which a player sort of negotiate and wrestles through with the system. But we are committed to sort of measuring the perceived impact of our actions as coaches so that we can set this as a basis for some, future strategizing and planning. So I'll just pass back to Jos to provide some more context around how we might go about doing that. Just on mute, Jos.
Cool, thanks, Tom. Try and go back to that original slide. 1 second, I have to unshare. Cool. So going back to this, as Tom said, like, big question for us, certainly in this phase of the season now, is how do we measure and monitor whether there's been some success or learning, I guess, against some of the goals that we had for the season. I think I did reference it earlier, but it's really important. We felt that we review this whilst the season is in place, and it's not just something that we just pick up at the end of the season, have a set review day or review days, and then just move forward. It's something that if we want to critically reflect on, we have to do that whilst in the moment, and that is difficult when we're in a busy football season. So I think that it's important to stress that we felt that it was really important to block out time to do so. And I think probably one of the good things we do at Fulham is we actually have sort of dedicated weeks every sort of 7 weeks within a cycle where staff will come together and robustly review how the last 6 weeks worth of training has gone. So yeah, some dedicated time to that. And also I think probably one of the things, as Ben said, about measuring and using data, the one clear thing on here that we can definitely do that within is some of the chance creation work that's happened this season. And Batu Osdal, our analysis is, he's currently gone through a really robust review of all of the chances that we created and broke that down within sort of individuals, shot locations, XG of the assist of the chance, and then we'll obviously feed back into sort of a more wider goal and team delivery when we review this within the next couple of weeks. I think my last point on this is we want this review process that we're going through and the measuring that we're going through to inform future practice. So as I said, this is a very much a longer term plan. So the review that we go through now should hopefully inform the planning for next season without deviating away from some of the goals that are on this page as well. The challenge for myself, Tom, and the multidisciplinary staff, some of which will move up into the under-16 season because of the nature of the club that we work at. We aren't in the luxury of having sort of individuals that are set for age groups, which I think's a real positive in some degree, because it means that there's good understanding of individuals across age groups. So yeah, I guess the challenge moving into under 16 season is now how do we transfer this? How do we share some of the goals with different under 16 staff, which again we're going to be looking to go through in the off season. I think that's pretty much all from myself, Tom, and Ben now. So over to you, Tom, again, and open to any questions.
Thanks, Jos. I think just really conscious of time. So thanks for all those guys who've added questions in. We'll just pick these up into our in our sort of structured Q&A session after the first half. So thanks for posing those. But I'm going to move swiftly on to senior lecturer in both physical education and sport coaching, Liam McCarthy.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tom. What a joy to be here with hundreds of coaches, coach developers from a wide variety of coaches, a wide variety of countries, around the world. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world at the moment. As Tom said, I'm a senior lecturer and coach at the university, and I've spent the last 10 years just over working in the coach development space. And this includes time spent with national governing bodies, in Japan with the ICC and CDA family, but also in the USA with the United States Centre for Coaching Excellence. And it's these global experiences that are really reflected in the professional development in football coaching module, which I lead on the master's programme. On this module, we invite students to look back at a developmental journey up to this point. We ask them to, or invite them to, conduct a critical review of their coaching practice in the present. And we also encourage them to identify a way forward to address any issues that are revealed within this review. And as part of this work, we draw upon and are inspired by the work of some of the very best people in the field. And one of those is Andrew Gillott. Andrew is someone who we're really lucky to be able to call a friend. And amongst many other roles, Andrew is a senior coach developer for UK Sport. And we're really lucky, I feel, to have Andrew on the call with us today. And so without taking up any further time, I'd really love it, Andrew, if you could share with us just some of your experiences of reflections upon supporting coaches in the field across a really wide variety of settings.
Thanks, Liam. It is a real pleasure to be here, actually. And I thought I was going to arrive very late, but I managed to catch Chris and Ben and Jos, which was really not only interesting, but brought to my attention the fact that Ben himself, who's just preceded me, is a very experienced coach developer. And Jos referred to the fact that with Ben's guidance, with Ben's support. So knowing that I've no doubt there are plenty other experienced and knowledgeable colleagues in this area, I thought I'd try and fill in the gaps around it. Because although I have worked in football, I've had the nature of my role as a coach developer has caused me to work in a lot of different places. I've worked pretty much, well, I've certainly worked on each continent and in a lot of different environments. So although I don't want to paint a glamorous picture, because it's still true that the average week for me would probably be a Ginster's pasty in the back of the car. There have been weeks when I've found myself working in, say, Performance Circus. I've worked with Cirque du Soleil. I've come back to do some work with a coach who's a head coach in an Olympic program or Paralympic program. Done some work with motorsport, with the performing arts, with music, conservatoires. So I've worked not just in sport, but across lots of human performance environments. And maybe that's where I can fill in some gaps of stories and experiences, Liam. I suppose one question that might come to mind is what binds all of those environments together? What makes it possible to work in environments or with games, using that as in the loosest sense of the word, that on the surface have very little in common? I'm just going to pin your video, Liam, so I have someone to talk to who's central. That's good. Right, that's good. It's just eyes darting everywhere. Right, so, and there are a few things. One of those is that all of the people who are working in those environments need a degree of support all of the time. All of the time. And related to that has been an observation that many of the sports and organisations I've worked with have not been particularly very good at thinking about the periodicity or the periodisation of coach development. So, for example, one thing that's been very common and prevalent is that in people's downtimes, they might be given the opportunity to learn new things. what is also prevalent is a sense that as major competitions get close or major performances get close, then we need to leave the coaches alone and just let them get on with it. And yet, my own experience has been that whenever I'm approaching something which is particularly stressful, that feels particularly big, that's just when I need the most support. And I can't be the only person who feels like that. So I think that some of the organisations have got caught up in the idea that the development and support of coaches is about learning new things. And if you look at it from that perspective, that I'm being in total agreement with them. Learning new things is for the beginning of cycles. If I think Olympically, I think of 4 years. The end of that cycle is not the time for learning new things, but it is the time for support. It is still the time to be seeing the returns on hypothesis that you've made over those 4 years. So the periodisation of support to practitioners, which might begin with experiments, research and innovation in pedagogy or learning. I really liked the way that Ben repeated a few times that supporting learning, because ultimately that's all I'm doing as well, and trying to help others do that. So there's that periodisation that begins with education, goes through a period of development and experimentation, and throughout, but particularly as we reach major goals, it's about support, just being there for people. And I think that despite the fact that I would draw on a very large and broad, deep empirical base, ultimately, a very simple way of describing the work is to say that we support people to give them what they need when they need it. And sometimes that's just a pat on the back. Another thing that struck me was this element of pulling together. There's a talk about multidisciplinary teams. Chris was talking about the use of performance analysis, which I'd actually like to touch on in a moment. But a puller, a togetherer might be a better name for a coach developer, but it doesn't look as good on business cards. So coach developer is the job title we get. But in many ways, I recognise the fact that a coach is a single star in a very large and complex constellation. And although we can do work which is meaningful on a one-to-one basis, like support, very often pulling together all of the different threads that are dangling in performance teams are where we really begin to feel a sense that it was worth being there in the first place, what's sometimes called an impact. So sometimes my work is about gluing together teams, I think. So for example, Chris talked about choosing to use performance analysis or choosing to use video clips. And it's interesting to me that in some of the teams that I've worked with, including right now, what they choose to attend to and what they choose to ignore in video is entirely predicated, of course, based on what they think the game is, what they think the performance problems are that they face in that game, or the athletes face, and how they best solve those. And as Ben and Joss had just illustrated, that depends very much based upon a game philosophy and how you interpret the who, what, and how and why of your sport. Even at the highest levels, and by that I mean in my context, the highest level would be a coaching team which have been together for 3 or 4 cycles, have multiple gold medals between them, and are effectively serial winning teams. And yet it's still the case that in those teams it is possible to discover quite significant disparities between the way that they see the game and how they think they should best proceed. One of the knock-on effects of that, in fact, the ultimate knock-on effect, is, of course, the communication with the athlete. So that could be the kind of game where there are just seconds to intervene, a short period of time, a timeout. I did catch the reference to The Last Dance. It was brilliant, wasn't it, Tom? So that just a short time out where we might have an opportunity to engage with an athlete and retreat, or indeed it might manifest itself in an independent development plan, which has very significant impacts on an athlete over 1, 2, 3 or 4 years. And yet the origins of the shape of that plan, the origins of that interaction in the 10-second timeout, it all comes from what that coach really thinks the game comprises of, what they think the performance problems are, and how they've interpreted what they've seen in front of them. So helping teams to see things in a similar way, or to agree on what they might look for and what they might discard at certain times of the cycle is all part of the job. And I think finally I was going to say, Liam, that I think the other thing that's very similar across all the environments I work in is that there is a constant tension between the espoused theories that coaches have, that is what they say they believe, and indeed truly will tell you that they're not hiding anything, just what they really believe about supporting learning, to coin that phrase, and how they do it in real time. And it's genuinely not because they choose to say one thing to your face and do something else behind your back. It's because ultimately our practice is driven by our beliefs and the structures that we've formed, that we build our practice upon. So as a consequence, the biggest part of the job, I think, in all of the environments is finding ways of generating feedback, of raising people's awareness of the disparity between what it is that they really genuinely want to achieve and the way they're going about trying to achieve it. And it's that, I think, also that allows you to be able to work across multiple environments, because many of the skills, if I have any at all, not so sure that's the case really. I feel like I fell into everything, but if I have any skills, it might be about finding ways of raising people's awareness of their practice in different environments. Or as someone did once say to me, and I'll end with this because it was a pleasurable moment when someone said, I really like the way you're able to punch me in the face while smiling. So I thought that was a nice way of summing up the coach development experience.
Thank you, Andrew. I've got a couple of questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could share with me, or share with us all, sorry, I should say, some strategies that you use or approaches that you take, or ways in which you very practically raise awareness or gather insight about the coach, with the coach, about their practice.
Yeah, so one of my favoured ways of doing this actually is to start off. I mean, no process is ever perfect, and what you might want and what you end up getting are often two very different things. But I suppose if I could design an interaction, what a beautiful thing, then I would, as I actually spent yesterday, I sat quietly listening in to multidisciplinary teams meetings with coaches and the other sports medicine, sports science staff and PA, a performance analyst. And you begin to get an idea of some of the things, the assumptions and the knowledges that their practice is built on. And that begins to give you some kind of picture. Then in this perfectly sequenced series of events, I would go out and watch them work. I spend almost all of my time just working alongside coaches and standing with them, which I regret is not something I've been able to do for a few weeks now. And whilst standing alongside them, you're beginning to notice how there might be strong differences between what they say they're after and the way they're going about it, if you like. One of the most practical ways of raising awareness could be to do some performance analysis in its most basic level. That is to clip some video and provide, and to sit with a coach and work through that and ask them to talk me through it and to explain how their actions and behaviours were contributing towards the goal, if you like. And however, because these things are never simple, Liam, and it's a nice question, it's a lovely setup question because there's lots you can talk about. But I think one thing that I'm aware of right now is that when I notice discrepancies, and they're mine. So when things raise awareness in the environment, 15, 20 years ago, I would have said, oh, do you notice that? You're not. Whereas now I recognise that when I think something's not quite right, it's my expectations that are not being met. It's not necessarily the coaches. So I have the luxury, Liam, of having quite a lot of time with people. People become projects, they become long-term investments. It's like I began my working life as a teacher, and there'll be plenty of other people who did that on here. And those people will recognise the idea that people are long-term investments. So with that luxury, I have an opportunity to take it easy, take it slowly. If I begin to find myself jumping to a conclusion, I have another opportunity to go and see them, to speak to them. I like to change environments and remember that the way that somebody behaves in one environment with a certain set of people will be very different to a different environment with a different set of people out of their awareness. So even drawing conclusions about how someone tends to behave or how someone tends to think or respond, I think is dangerous territory to be walking into unless you've got plenty of time to investigate and think about. And on that, Liam, I'd say that probably the biggest tool in the toolbox, the biggest hammer, is just simply watching someone work and thinking, to work in that way, what must you have to believe? What must you have to believe about learning? What must you have to believe about the way that people, what motivates people? And build up a picture almost from a first person perspective. And so you go into those first interactions with empathy. And that's, I think, probably that is always going to be the biggest tool in the toolbox. So if you've got no models and frameworks at your disposal, just pull out the empathy.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much. There's a load more things I could ask you. I'm really conscious of time, and we will stick to time. So I'll finish the questions there. But as always, I've learned a lot from that. From a selfish perspective, I've made half a page of notes. So I really appreciate that, Andrew. And I hope others have benefited in similar ways. Thank you so much. And with that, I'm back over to Tom.
Pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liam. Thanks, Andrew. All fascinating insight into some of your experiences. By all means, if Liam and Andrew, you do have time, feel free to sort of maybe answer some of the questions through typing the answers, such as Ben and Jos have started to do. But we'll move on to say our last sort of session before our structured Q&A. So I'll hand over to Senior Lecturer across the suite of football coaching programs here at St Mary's, Michael Ayres.
Good. I was going to say good morning, but hello everyone. And again, thank you for joining me. I guess it's at this point with the final few minutes before half time that everyone goes off to get their cup of tea and coffee. But the guest that I have on today is well worth listening to. There will be, I will be sharing with you a few slides, but I guess this is initially this is a story of an Englishman who works in a higher education institute, has worked at a professional football club academy for the last 15 years, who had the pleasure of working with a professor or visiting professor, Len Almond, who sadly died 2 or 3 years ago, who's the founding forefather of the Teaching Games for Understanding movement, and an Irishman by the name of Gerry Murphy, who I would, by all means, Gerry, please disagree with this, but who I would call a colleague, a friend and a mentor. So I guess for the next sort of 10, 15 minutes, it's just for us to tell our story of how the relationship came about, some of the research that's come out of this, and I think this will be a good example of some of the variety of research methods that potential students will be able to access when they're undertaking their PFC 7004 Applied Research Methods module. So I'd like to take you back to 2013. And I'd like to bring in a colleague of mine, Gerry Murphy. Gerry, could you just explain to the audience or introduce yourself, and please, I know you're a man of few words, but please, a full historical background will be much appreciated.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for a fantastic invitation. It's nice and sunny here in Dublin too, which is great. I really should be out in the garden, but getting calls from Michael as always demands attention. Perhaps I should explain two things. First of all, Leinster Rugby is obviously a first-class professional rugby team, but at the same time, there is a province of Leinster. And our brief is to cover the province. There is the team and there is the province. And the province is all the rugby that happens in the province of Leinster, which is 12 counties. It's about 47 senior rugby teams. It's schools and clubs. And Leinster has always been at the forefront, going back to the 1960s, in coach development. And some of us were fortunate enough over the years to meet many very famous coach developers over the years. And as Leinster expanded since 1995 as a professional entity, we were able to employ coaches in the last 10 years or so to help with the domestic game. And in about 2013, I contacted Len Almond with a view to perhaps picking his brains on coming and talking to our coaches on teaching games for understanding or a game-centered approach. And I sent him an email. I introduced myself. I had been listened to him over the years or read his work over the years, and I sent him an email asking for his help. And by return, the ping came back immediately, and the email said, Michael, can you deal with this because I haven't time to? And then he suddenly realized that he had sent it to me rather than to Michael. Then Michael got in touch with me and we got together, and I was trying to explain to him, we didn't have quite as many at that stage, but we now have something like 50 coaches working the domestic game. And to a large extent, they would coach with traditional drills and things like that, or they had done so. And we needed to get away from that, and we needed to broaden our outlook, if you like, broaden our coaching experience. And from very small beginnings, we had a workshop. Michael and Sam Page came over and introduced to a series of coaches the idea of a game-related approach to coaching. That's basically, in a nutshell, what happened. And since then, we've managed to change our philosophy. I was, again, very fortunate. Len came to the first, one of our early workshops, and I was fortunate enough then to go and meet him on, come across to England and stay with him and things like that. But we changed the philosophy from a traditional drill-based approach to coaching into what we do now as a matter of course, which is all our coaches, with St Mary's help, Michael and Tom and Sam and Fiona Wilson, people like that, come over, give workshops to us, for our coaches, for not only the staff coaches, but for everybody else that we can invite. And it has changed our outlook. And I'm glad to say now that across the board, our professional coaches, now these wouldn't be coaches who coach in the professional team as per se, but we all have adapted this idea of coaching through the game. And while rugby is extremely, it can be a complex game, it still leads itself to this approach. And I must say it's been I think the thing more than anything else, it's been how much the coaches, our own coaches, and a lot of them are young guys starting on the coaching path, and not like me who's fallen off it many, many years ago. They really enjoy it. And we found too that we were dealing with schools and youth players who play in clubs, that the kids enjoy it. And that's the whole point of the whole thing. So that's really, in a nutshell, what we sort of do, Michael.
That's brilliant, Gerry, and thank you for the background. And I won't embarrass you, but Gerry's very modest. So when he talks about his coaching career, we're not necessarily just talking about the fourth 11 down the local club, but I will let people look that one up if they wish to do so. The relationship is between myself and Leinster has evolved and developed to the extent now where we're beginning to engage in some research. When I initially went over there, and that they often spoke about the Leinster way, but like a lot of football clubs and other elite sports clubs couldn't necessarily sort of identify what the Leinster way was. So from that initial inquiry, I became very curious around, well, how does an organisational culture and the values it possesses interacts and impacts upon not only coach learning, but also player learning. And then if we flip that on its head, how can the coaches and the players within that environment then begin to exert and influence themselves and their values to increase and maximise their opportunities to learn. So just, I think hopefully this the approach that we've taken reflects a very pragmatic research design whereby the methodologies have consistently changed and developed over time. One of the initial pieces of work that we undertook was to begin to identify what values underpinned the Leinster way, and I was very fortunate enough to be able to interview what we call the cultural architects of the rugby club. So those who have developed and embody the values of the organisation. I was also able to look at the historical context of some of the books that Leinster have published over a period of time on the development of rugby within the region, and also the development of coaches within Leinster, and how that's been influenced by a variety of sources and individuals. And Gerry, I hope you don't mind me sharing this, but these are the rugby department values that were generated out of those initial inquiries. And when you begin to look at some secondary coding, the headline values of love, leading and learning are truly embodied and brought to life through the interactions that Leinster colleagues have with one another and the interactions they have with their learning, and also the development of the players. So we're beginning to look slightly deeper into some of those values, and then we're just beginning to frame, in terms of a learning framework, looking at and analysing some of those opportunities for learning to take place within the organisation of Leinster Rugby. I'll just minimise that, sorry, take it off screen share. So that provides an overview of some of the various methodologies and approaches that we've used from a research design. Gerry, I just wondered if you were able to answer some of the questions that some people have sent in. So Luke asks, you've obviously worked in a lots of different settings. What sort of impact do you think culture has on how people coach? So the cultural values that the organisation has, whether that's in a school or a club setting, how do you think that has a direct impact upon the methods coaches may well use within their coaching environments?
Yeah, I think it has a huge, absolutely huge, it's certainly in Leinster, it has a huge impact. With the project with St Mary's, we're actually very fortunate because we can develop these ideas both with our coaches and with our clubs and schools. It's sort of a hand-in-hand thing. And one of the culture it's a two-way thing. It does come from the top down. We're very fortunate at the moment that people like Leo Cullen and Stuart Lancaster are coaching the senior team. But it's also from the bottom up. And one of the things that we have tried to get across to both our young coaches and our kids, and maybe we can talk about our kids just in a few moments, but we try and say a very simple thing to them, the things that matter. And the first thing is your club. Now, it could be your club or your school. I mean, you might join a club because you want to play for that club. Schools have their own ethos and all the fantastic things that all the schools have. The second thing that we try to bring through is the team. And the team is the people that you are playing with every Saturday morning, and the guy, when you miss a tackle, who's going to give you a dig out and cover for you. And that's important. And the third thing is yourself. And it's not in a selfish way at all. It's in to be the best that you can be and to strive to be the best you can be. Again, in a very simple way. And we found that has worked, and it's not in any way dictatorial. This is, we're talking to kids, or in the same way talking to our coaches. And quite a lot of our coaches have not come from a phys ed background, say. They have come probably from a rugby background, all right. So what St Mary's has been able to do for them is exactly that. The team, or the club is Leinster, right? That's the team is the people that they have around them, but themselves, that they improve, they go on their coaching journey. And I mean, I was very fortunate over many years to meet hugely inspirational coaches. You can think, I was thinking this morning of people like Chalky White, who coached Leicester in the 1980s, who was amazingly never actually coached England, but was a hugely influential coach at the time. So that's the culture. That culture is there in Leinster. It is from the bottom up. If you're narrowing it down, it's in our own interest, because I think we have over 80% of our professional team are homegrown players, which is quite unique actually. And if you add in the academy and people just below, we're dealing with maybe 100 or so kids. But the important thing from the culture point, if you can think of yourselves, I'm sure you can picture the normal triangle where you have a huge big base at the bottom and it funnels into the superstars at the top. So what we are said recently, or a lot of us have thought all the time, is why don't you just turn that completely around so that you start with an individual. The apex is at the bottom with an individual, and the pyramid goes broader as you go up with the knowledge that they pick up on the way. And so that when you come to the top, you don't have a narrow field to pick from almost, if you want to be absolutely precise about it. You have a much broader field. And people that don't necessarily, there are people who may not want to play professional rugby, but they may like to join a rugby club or whatever, or do a bit of coaching themselves with their own kids. So the more people that you have qualified in some way to do this, is the better. That is the way Leinster work. And it's, to a certain extent, it has always been like that, in not as concise as it is now.
Brilliant, Gerry. Thank you for that. I'm conscious of time, Tom. One question that maybe yourself, Gerry, and Ben Bartlett can answer. I know Ben came over and did a brilliant session around how we can link coaching practices and methodologies between rugby and football. Maybe Ben Bartlett can tell the story of when he came over and introduced the kicking game to the coaches at Leinster. But maybe Ben can answer that towards the end of this webinar. Gerry, I think we've run out of time, so I'm going to hand back to Tom. But Gerry, just to say thank you for giving up your time. I know you're currently officially retired now, so we've taken some precious time out of your day and from your garden. So thank you very much for joining us. And yeah, I'm sure everyone that has thoroughly enjoyed you sharing some of your stories today.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Gerry. Gerry, it's always great to listen to you, particularly with such a personal resource. So thanks for your time this morning. really conscious about time, and I know that in terms of hard structure, Tom Howard and Ben Knight were due to commence at 11:15. So what I suggest we do is that if you have any questions and you want to take stock of sort of the first half, please do so and pose your questions in the Q&A function, and our guests will do their best to answer those in sort of a public manner. If you want to take 5 minutes, we'll reconvene at 11:20. Like I said, we'll answer the questions as that goes through. But if you need a toilet break or you want to stick the kettle on, then feel free to do that within the next 5 minutes, and we'll start formally the second half at 11:20 and half. Hopefully, everyone's had the opportunity to have a quick comfort break. Up next, I'd like to introduce a lecturer across the suite of football coaching programs here at St Mary's, Tom Howard.
Thanks, Tom. As Michael has alluded to previously, our research methods module aims to develop students' understanding of the different strategies that can be adopted to both collect and analyse data, with the objective of trying to best align these with the research question and the objectives of the research. It's also hoped that these skills can then be harnessed in the future to conduct applied research activity. My own research interests lie in the field of talent development and specifically the role of the parent-coach-athlete dynamic. This has led me into exploring the parent perspective in more detail, specifically within academy football environments, in an attempt to further understand how we can optimise this relationship. I'm really fortunate to be joined by Ben Knight this morning, lead phase coach of the under-9 and under-10s at Chelsea Academy. Ben has worked in both the academy and first team environments at the club for more than a decade now, and someone who I'm really grateful to be able to call a colleague, friend and mentor. Ben is going to share some of the key strategies he adopts when trying to formulate positive relationships with parents and family networks of players when first entering the academy environment. Ben's short presentation will help highlight how some of the key trends from aligned talent development research and sport parenting research have been considered and, more importantly, delivered in practice. Over to you, Ben.
Cheers, Tom. Thanks for the invite today, and it's a pleasure to now share some of the practical examples and strategies that we use to bring it to life, really, in order to build these positive relationships with our young players and families. We're obviously very hopeful that they're going to be at our club and on this journey for some time. So the importance we hold in this area is very, very high. There's three key areas really to our approach. So if we look at, we're going to take a little delve into these three and what we do. So to support their holistic education, we talk a lot about the approachability of our staff within the phase and our organisation as well. So in terms of our holistic education, I think this photo is really, really key. The one on the left is now what some parents and players start to identify themselves as. Academy players, they're labelled as footballers, elite talents, stars of the future. But we must remember they're still 8 and 9 years of age. And we've got to remember that they are young people, they're children. You know, we got under 9s currently that don't turn 9 for about another month. So crazy to think that they've already been in our programme for some time and they're still 8 years of age. So they're kids. We need to make sure that they and we explore and allow them to have individuality and can be creative. And likewise, we've got a responsibility to support their social and emotional well-being. There's kind of three pillars really to our holistic approach, or the education side of it. The first one is something that we're really fortunate to have the backing and support of our senior colleagues at the football club, but we've got a very, very good social development programme in place for our under 9s and under 10s. It's a 2-year programme where they travel on a multi-activity adventure weekend. I've got a video actually that will take you into a little bit more detail of what they do, but in short, this is their first experience of travelling with the academy. It's an opportunity for them to integrate with one another, to build relationships themselves and friendships that could last, decades or longer, but also to travel without that anxiety really of having to stay over and then compete and play football with eyes on them from dads or mum or parents, really mums and dads or uncles and aunties, grandparents that travel abroad to see them play. So it's that first experience, and I think what we really try and do is to make sure that the staff get to learn about the boy and get to know more about the boy, rather than just look at them as a footballer. Get to know, how they behave, how they build friendships, what they enjoy outside of football, and to also, share that message to the parents that, or to remind the parents, I would say that yes, they're an academy player now, but they're a child, and look at the enjoyment that they can have. We've got a really strong, values and behaviours system within our programme to make sure that we're building, a really positive culture and developing really good people. And the coaches will deliver this within their training, but also it becomes a real common language across the young players. Some of the examples I could use are that we want them and the values to become a language and to become a way of behaving on and off the pitch. We celebrate them. We've got almost like a postcard celebration system that if one of the boys displays these within a training environment or when we're on tour or off the pitch, we will send them a postcard that their parents will obviously receive. It'll be in their name when it goes through the door, and then they get to share that with their child. And in most cases, they don't even know that they've displayed it. And again, we've got some good examples of these behaviours being shown from a social development trip and taken into their wider kind of football journey. And then we've got our education as well, where the parents and players have provision by way of workshops. It could be anything from equality, diversity work to we've got kind of online safety, social media type stuff. And then obviously we provide them a number of resources to help them as well with nutrition and things and aspects that can help them in their life. All right. And what I want to do is kind of bring to life the holistic program by showing you a short video now. It's only around 90 seconds. Hopefully you'll be able to hear the music to it as well. If not, you should be able to get the picture. Yeah, I hope that gives you an idea of the early approach that we take in terms of breaking down the barriers for the players, and it's a really good one to build that relationship with the family as well, because it is that first trip. We need parents on board to trust us, to make sure that their son is going to be safe and happy. And in many cases, we've had some wonderful examples and positive feedback around just how welcome their son now feels after participating in this activity. Likewise, it's a 2-year programme, so the under-9s will travel as the new recruits as such, and then where they travel again as under-10s, they then have a little bit of responsibility or the opportunity to be a young leader and to help the young players as well through their kind of first days in the academy. So it's a fantastic trip that really encompasses, you know, our values and our beliefs of how we want these boys to be perceived and seen. So it's had, you know, such a positive effect on the academy and the way our staff can then continue to build relationships after that. And I think the trip actually really helps us become more approachable to the parents and show that, you know, they can talk to us easily, that we are friendly, that we do want to support them beyond, you know, their son improving their technical or tactical understanding. A huge one for me is the interaction. The staff are fantastic at building those positive relationships and conversations. And within my role as the lead phase coach, I've actually come off of the grass one night per week. So the players train a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, Sunday, or sorry, train on a Saturday, play matches on a Sunday. On a Thursday, I'll take myself out of the, you know, off of the pitch, and I will be face to face and really kind of front of house and walk in the touch lines and making sure that everything's okay, and really starting to get to know the family. As you can imagine, many of these boys have siblings, either younger or older as well, that have to, you know, not have to, but often travel to the training ground and the games to support their brother that's obviously a good talent at this time. So it's great getting to know them and allowing them time and space to build friendships with one another. It also helps me, I believe, in stopping a number of reactive conversations you might need to have, whether they're, you know, I can find out whether their understanding of what's happening at the weekend, or I can answer questions relating to any area really, and it's been a fantastic thing for me over the last few years to give more time to them, and for them to see again that I'm very approachable on a Thursday evening and can answer any of their queries or questions. It also allows time for the coaches really to concentrate on what they're doing on the pitch as well during those nights, and I can take that responsibility of supporting the parents in another way. And then lastly, there is the openness. We do believe that we are, you know, very honest. We want to build that trust. Across under 9 and 10, our games programme, it is all about opportunity and experiences. So we won't be looking at performance-based squads. It will be making sure that by the time they end their under 10 year, the journeys that they've been on are very much the same. We wouldn't want to go too selective too soon, because, you know, you need to give the boys the chance to travel, the chance to play equal minutes, a variety of positions, etc. So we're very, very clear on that early. And I think that honesty and that understanding of the parents, it just helps them then buy into the programme as well. And then lastly, our organisation, I think, is key for any young parent or any parent of a young child in an elite environment or in a football academy, is to know what the programme looks like and what they're up to. It looks very, very busy, as you can see from my example there. That's a copy of under 9 and 10. Not all players will travel to every activity, of course. So, you know, we'll have to communicate that, and we do it really well and make sure that parents, you know, get minimum 6 weeks in advance so they can plan their life. It also has scheduled breaks for family-free weekends, which are a really positive thing, because it allows them to visit wider family or go to the beach, or, you know, to have a little weekend away, as examples, or just do something other than football, which is key for these kids. And then lastly is that we really do support other activities, be that school, be it another sport, and hobbies and interests. So I think giving that planner early allows them to plan, and allows to see them what they should be, what they could be doing, but likewise, they can also inform staff early. If they have got a school football match, if they've got a game on a Thursday, don't come training, we'll see them Saturday. And likewise, we've got boys that are very good tennis players. We've got children that participate in judo and karate. And sometimes on a Saturday, they might have a grading every 6 to 8 weeks. But we're very, very, we want to make sure that they still have those other interests and developing those skills, because ultimately it could really support their longer term development anyway within the football club. So listen, I hope over those kind of little brief examples that I've given you, just about how we want to support them holistically, how our staff are very, very approachable, but at the same time very organised, to help build that early family relationship, to support them on and off the pitch, and we hope that really does help guide them through their academy life. But it's very, very child-centred, and the staff do a wonderful job of making sure that yes, they're playing to the levels that we want them to, but they're having lots of fun, and they're still able to show that individuality that we would want them to. All right, so thank you very, very much for listening.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Certainly really, really appreciate you sharing in so much detail. Just one thing I wanted to touch upon, and probably the highlight for me this season was seeing, and I think the video showcased it brilliantly, some of our boys' faces seeing a beach for the first ever time. So just a question back to you, Ben, to share with everyone else. How do you think those incredible life experiences that we're able to provide the young boys have really helped you and us in developing those relationships with the parents?
I think having access, and we were lucky, Tom, aren't we, that we could have, we took a cameraman away with us, to capture those moments, and the importance of them sharing them back with their families. But we've got some, it's great seeing those boys walk onto a beach for the first time. What we've got to remember is they come from very different backgrounds and cultures, and some boys will live in a high-rise block somewhere in central London and not have that life opportunity that others may get. So giving them that experience is unbelievable. But then I remember I travelled on a trip with yourself to Italy, to Verona. There was a penalty shootout, and one boy didn't want to take one. He was frightened. He wouldn't put himself forward, and another boy turned to him openly within the group, and we're talking about 8-9-year-olds here, and to turn around and say to his friend that really he's only met a couple of months ago, hold on a minute, when we went on PGL, you did not want to abseil. He went, but you did that. He said, you abseiled and you were scared. He went, but you still managed it. He went, so you can take a penalty. You're a good footballer. So it was like an 8-9-year-old having that conversation and being able to relate actually back to the trip and some of the individual experiences that they'd had. Challenging too, some of them, it's not easy coming down an abseiling tail. I was useless. But for some of these young people to do it, who were frightened for trying some things for the first time, but to then actually relate some of their feelings and emotions on a football pitch. And as you know, the boy stepped up and took a penalty and scored. And listen, whether he scored or not, it wouldn't have mattered to have the courage in the end to go and do it. But to witness an 8 and 9-year-old have that type of conversation just, I think, shows the power that this sort of experience that we gave them has already, help them on in their first steps.
Yeah. Again, a huge thank you, Ben. There's been some more questions come through, but I think we're probably leave them to a little bit later. I'm conscious about time. So, Tom, probably the perfect opportunity to pass back to yourself.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Tom. Really fascinating insight into sort of holistic development that you are encouraging and fostering at Chelsea, and also maybe beginning to challenge some of the constructs of the way in which players begin to identify themselves. So thank you very much for your time. I'll pass over to the Assistant Director of the Suite of Football Coaching Programmes and Head of Performance Analysis, Patrick Oxenham.
Thanks, Tom. Just quickly share my slides. Good afternoon, everyone. So we're now moving on to PFC 7005, and it's been quite refreshing to listen to everyone else's presentations today. And I think the majority have touched upon this already and almost taken away my introduction. I know Chris mentioned it about his work with VEA. Tom, Ben, Jos spoke about their work with performance analysts, and Andrew spoke about it a lot in terms of that analyst being very much embedded within that multidisciplinary team. So in terms of that, the module itself very much focuses on you as a coach and how you as a coach utilize performance analysis as a supportive tool to enable that development and performance within your players. So we very much throughout the module touch upon various different theoretical concepts, and very much from an applied perspective, you get to utilize the softwares that we have available at the university in Coach Logic, so that collaborative platform that you can utilize with your players, and Angle software where you can carry out your notational analysis to inform your coaching process. So very much like we have on screen, we touch upon loads of different components within that. It's really difficult within a 12-week block to cover everything, but we try and give you the best tools possible for you to apply within your own coaching context. And we take that one step further in a sense that we don't just get you to carry out your analysis. We actually look at how you apply what you've identified in terms of strengths and areas of improvement, and then applying that to your own coaching practice. So an example that we've got here on the screen is more of a post-match session where we've identified that we're potentially weak playing out from the back and beating that press and playing through lines, and we look at actually how we translate that into session design, so you can kind of continually work around that coaching process. And what I'll do is I'll pass over to Dan Parker, who will speak a little bit more about his work with the FA, more from a pre-match perspective in terms of looking at opposition and then scaling that level of feedback across the various different age groups throughout the FA. And Dan, I'm sure you'll touch upon your experiences in a little bit more depth, but we're really lucky to have him today. And I think our first meeting was outside Burger King in East Midlands before we flew out to Germany to do our master's degree together. Obviously, Dan, you've taken a different route than I have, gone straight into the FA after your master's degree, and have been there ever since. And if I'm right in saying you're part of the team out in Russia in 2018 at the World Cup. Yeah. Ever so close to bringing football home again. So yeah, very lucky to have you today, Dan. So thank you very much for joining us. So I'll stop my screen share and pass over to you.
Brilliant. Let's just share my screen. Perfect. So I currently work with so I lead on the men's and the 16s, but as Pat said, I also work as part of the team on the men's seniors. So I'm in a sort of unique position where I see opposition analysis and also coaching and the MDT work at the various ends of the spectrum. So today I'm going to talk through the pathway a little bit. I'm going to talk about how we sort of scale our service provisions to the age group that we're working with, which is slightly different to a club in that essence, because we've got age groups ranging from under 15s all the way up to the senior team. Also, before we end, I'm just going to touch on how we tailor our opposition analysis at major tournaments, so touch on those major milestones throughout the season. But just to start with, I'm going to talk through the international journey. So as I said, we range from under 15s to the senior team and have an MDT staff at every single one of these age groups. So the 15s and 16s is predominantly just talent ID years. So we try and see as many players as possible. There's no real competitive competitions, but it's ultimately to try and identify those core players that we might be able to take forwards. At 17s and 19s every year, there is a European Championships. And if you do well at those every 2 years, they go on to an under-18 and an under-20 World Cup. If you don't have a World Cup or you don't qualify for the World Cup, the 18s and 20s really become sort of the talent development years. So your better players will probably get taken by the age groups further up the chain, as they have been recently, but the senior team taking quite a lot of the younger lads up. So really it's a chance to look at what else is out there and who else is out there in terms of who we can work with and try and prepare those for international football and just prepare them for the professional game as best we can. The under 21s, there is on 2-year cycles, there's also European Championships. So there'll be a 2-year qualifying cycle for those championships, and they take place before we reach the senior team, where we'll play the Nations League games, Euro 2020, sort of the World Cups, and sort of the senior team that everybody knows. But in terms of this pathway in general, it comes with some constraints that are slightly different to the club game. So anything we implement has to be adapted to that. We wouldn't be able to necessarily actually implement things that clubs are able to in the same way. So really, outside of these major tournaments, we only get the players from 40 to 45 days for maximum outside of the clubs on international breaks. Everybody on the MDT staff, so it's coaches, it's analysis staff, some of the medics and the doctors. We've got education to contend with at the younger age groups, because players sit GCSEs during the European Championship finals. At the older age groups, we've obviously got sort of pre-season tours and players starting to really get into senior teams. So we have to contend with club politics and whether they've got competitions. We just need to really think about and tailor our service to those. Also, players come in and out of the pathway at different times, so you don't necessarily get a group of players at under 15s and work all the way up the pathway. Some players might start at 15, we work up a few years, they may drop out and then they come back in. Some players we may just get sort of under 20s and under 21s, and we really need to accelerate their learning. So they've obviously missed 4 or 5 years throughout the pathway and the processes we've got in place. But we really need to get them up to speed to make sure that they would be in a similar position to somebody who had gone through the pathway. And then finally, some of the consistency of players on camp, even if we had the 40 to 45 days every year with the players, not like there are different needs on each of those camps, and we don't necessarily see the same players every single camp. So it's a case of a collective movement and just accelerated learning where possible. But these are some of the constraints that we work under, both as sort of a coaching and MDT stuff, but also in sort of the opposition analysis phase. To focus on the youth development phase, to start with in the bottom of the pyramid and bottom of that pathway, it's all about laying the foundations for everything. So in terms of the overarching aims is really an introduction and development of how we play and work as an England team. And also it's about talent identification, trying to get around and see as many players at the clubs as possible and see who can come into the environment and really thrive and who's got the potential to go forwards. And if they're not necessarily at their best now, obviously we're looking for potential on who might be better later on as well. In terms of our aims as an analysis department, working with the young players between 15 and 17 is really around developing the players' football understanding through developing their analytical skill set, which essentially means just getting them used to watching content and then getting them used to talking about it with people that they don't necessarily know or are still getting to know, and talking about it in front of their peers, which is sort of 14 to 17-year-old lads can be difficult sometimes, but we sort of go at it from various ways. So we try and work through in terms of, we've got various workshops. These will be in team settings, they'll be in unit settings, so it might be defenders talking about defending. The players will have one-to-one meetings with coaches, whether it be to talk through training reviews or games, or even just best practice clips like we've mentioned previously today already. But we use sort of various methods within each of these. So we might use video. We usually take Sabutio and travel with Sabutio boards away with us to try and help sort of the off-field kinesthetic learning. And you can look at angles and where players are facing, and you get an idea of the space a little bit better than a tactics board. It might just be discussion based, it might be guided learning as well, but it's all to cater for the different learning styles and make sure that players are getting information various ways and to sort of cater for everybody. We've also used Huddle, which is just the online video platform, which we can put content up onto, and the players can watch that content in their own time and get used to the way in which England play, and watch their own games, and try and have feedback with the coaches and have those discussions with the coaches as well. All of which, throughout all of these various methods, sort of a two-way communication and player ownership is really encouraged. So in terms of, it's not just us telling you this is how England play, it's more around sort of the players getting comfortable in their own skin and comfortable as an international player and sort of comfortable talking to coaches around the game. Because ultimately they're the ones at the end of the day who are going to be on the pitch making some of those decisions. So they really need to understand sort of why they're making those decisions and what sort of cues they need to pick up on to make those decisions effectively. So in terms of the opposition analysis at this age group, as I say, it's more around talent identification, not necessarily around winning or moving towards any form of tournament. But sort of under 15s will be predominantly talent ID. It'll be training camps with 1 or 2 fixtures at home, and then one tournament normally towards the end of the year. But it's really just to get a feel and see how some of the players can deal with those sorts of pressures at this time. With under 16s, we start to drip feed a little bit more of opposition analysis in. So it's more an introduction to. So the tech team will go away and we'll watch select games of the opposition. We'll discuss sort of game plan considerations and potential performance problems it might cause us. But really what goes to the players is really just a real select few clips in game plan meetings and in pre-training meetings, but it's predominantly focused around what that means to us. And it's not that we're going to change completely what we do. It's more around slight tweaks in the game plan or slight things to be aware of that will either help exploit or help nullify some of their strengths or weaknesses. Under 17s, as we move towards the European Championships and potentially the World Cup if we qualify, it's more sort of applied and player-led, more down a guided learning model. So the tech team will create opposition video profiles from the games for the players to watch. And then really it's about getting their thoughts and feelings on the video content that we've put up for them to watch. And then we'll have a workshop around it. And essentially they'll come back with their thoughts around the opposition and what that could mean to us in our game plan. And it's a real open forum around sort of what they think and their thoughts around it. So they can help form some of the game plans. Moving on to the PDP and further up the pyramid, the overarching aims is really, it's a continuation and a development of the foundations laid. Not the principles remain the same, some of the methods might change slightly. And really it's around preparing players for senior team football, whether that be international level, playing for England and the senior team, whether it's going to be just a Premier League club or even sort of further down, because not all of the players make it at this age group. Around the opposition analysis, as I mentioned, it's a slight adaptation of the delivery methods to align to the sort of more professional methods, for want of a better term, but around sort of communicating with them and having grown-up conversations rather than trying to not engineer situations in which they can feed back. We gradually increase the tactical detail delivered to the players, as well as sort of an increased focus on set plays of individuals, of penalties of the opposition teams, and really begin to tailor our analysis delivery methods to individual players. So if the right back wants to look at the left winger and who he's going to come up against, we know that and we can tailor it to how he likes to see that. And it's really at this phase that we start drip feeding in some of the data in opposition analysis to coaches and the players and help really back up those key points. But as more information becomes available, it's really down to the skill of the analysts and the coaches to make sure that the messages going to the players are still clear, they're still concise, and they're still consistent. Some of the challenges we face at this phase is really, it's just constant change. As I previously mentioned, that under-19s championship sits in the middle of July, which starts affecting pre-season camps and travelling away with teams. Which means that politics and some of the relationships do start to get stretched a little bit. But from our perspective, it's if players aren't available, we need to make sure that the players coming in are up to speed as quickly as possible and accelerate their learning. And then just to finish off on just around we have 6 major milestones throughout the pathway on a regular basis, and they're the pinnacle of the season that they sit in, all the way from under 17s, all the way up to the World Cup. They're likely to be some of the biggest games that the players have played in and the coaches have coached in. So it's really about one of the key factors of success and a real competitive advantage we can add as an analysis department is speed of information. So to try and get from opposition analysis to a game plan to a training pitch as quickly as possible in tournaments where sometimes you have 2, 3, 4 day turnarounds. So it's really about accelerating that. So we scale the resource to back these up. So you've got the lower age group tournaments where you may take 2 analysts with the team. And then there'll be 2 or 3 additional analysts back at St George's Park in which they'll complete tournament match analysis. So they'll look through the games, other games in the group, and essentially a report will land on the analyst and coach's desk the day after they qualify, essentially. So if in a round of 16 situation, by the time they've finished the group, reviewed their own final group game, they will have an opposition report that they can then start working on and communicate with the analyst back at base on the main points that they may need to focus on that. But scaled up in terms of the resource to essentially the end point in a senior tournament. So this was just an example of what we used in Russia. There was 3 analysts out with a team. There was 1 manager who was there to deal with all the moving parts and the logistics and also deal with FIFA and the added bureaucracy that comes with such a tournament. We had 7 or 8 national and specialist coaches working on the tournament pre-tournament, so they backfilled some of the games and also followed those teams all the way through until they got knocked out or we played them. And then also we had 8 to 12 additional analysts back at St George's Park who did similar with some of the other teams. So by the time we'd even landed in Russia, we knew how 18 to 20 of the teams were playing in qualification and what they were all about. And then the job of the analyst was really the additional reports, more data coding around the team stats, some of the individuals, some of the set plays, some of the penalties, and really focusing on those key areas that could give us additional gains and additional competitive advantages. And also support the coaches to ensure that anything going out to the team comes in a a readable format that the coaches, the senior team coaches and the staff out there are used to receiving, so you don't end up with different language and those sorts of things. And then the idea was to consolidate all of that post-tournament study, consolidate that learning into a study so we knew where we were at in terms of world football, some of the trends and interesting things from the tournament that we could take forwards. But essentially, countries do this in different ways. So Germany have an army of interns, Brazil outsourced it to their club analysts, but we really feel that that we had enough good people in the building and the best people in the building to really facilitate what we needed for us. We did all of that to create that competitive advantage, and that model worked, and we were looking at similar models and how we adapt what we did there moving forwards into the Euros, which will be next year now. But yes, as an overview of what we do, that is essentially me.
Thanks, Dan. Fascinating insight into the level of detail that you give the various different age groups throughout that development pathway with the FA. So just a couple of questions. Obviously, questions coming from Brad Sutcliffe. You spoke a lot about talent ID within those earlier phases.
Yes.
As an organisation, what kind of analytical processes do you go through to determine someone that has, quite high potential and that you might stick with compared to, and then making those comparisons to other players?
Yes, so at the younger age groups, around the 15s and 16s, we like to focus more on the individual. So there's a little bit of team analysis that will happen around training in the games, but we try and focus on the individual just as much so, if not more so. So really it's around trying to analyse the training and the evidence, and so the constraints that the coaches put on them in training, and then also the various tests and milestones around games and fixtures. But we try and focus more around the team. And also we have a process in place that we have the same data code complete at the under 15s and 16s games than we do at the senior games in terms of the individuals. So we can start to plot and get a picture around positional profiles and that player profile and start to compare and contrast. And it's not necessarily used as the be all and end all by any means. It's more to inform a coach's opinion, because coaches and staff will always have their opinions on each of the players, and it's to try and challenge those or back them up as and when the challenges come in. But essentially we go from 80 players at under 15s down to about 30 players at under 17s that we may see on a regular basis, and it's to try and help that process around selection that we try and do that process.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. It's, you know, as analysts, we're not here to take over. We're there as the supportive tool, and sometimes, you know, data isn't the be all and end all, and it's very much just used to kind of support that decision making. Another question's come in from Matthew on already, and you spoke a lot about the different kind of, you know, workshops, presentations that are delivered within the FA. Who actually delivers that? Is it the coach? Do they take control, or is it the analyst, or is it a little bit of both?
It's mainly coach driven in terms of the presenter and the mouthpiece, if you like, but it's a real MDT sort of amalgamation of work. So within the MDT, it'll be the coaches at some of the more advanced age groups and the tournament age groups. They've got the performance psychs, but the psychs are there to try and help the coach as much as the players as well. So they'll help them in their delivery style. They'll help them in the way that they communicate with the players. So it's really a case of maybe 3 or 4 of us coming together, coming up with the content, agreeing it with the coach, and then agreeing not just the content, but the way in which it's delivered as well. And like I said, it's really trying to get a variety to ensure that you don't get that fatigue if you're away for 55 days at a Senior World Cup, or even 30 days at an under-17s Euros. It can become pretty grueling. So it's to really try and gauge where the group are at as well and what they need at that particular point.
And just because of time, Dan, we'll probably come back to this in the final Q&A, but just one more question. You obviously spoke about player learning and the different learning styles that these players might have. How do you go about, you know, that pre-bit where you start to identify the learning styles and start to identify what works for some players and what doesn't work for others? I know you spoke about time constraints, especially with them just coming to a particular camp. You know, how is that done so quickly to ensure that your analysis is effective?
Yeah, it is tough, particularly at the younger age groups when you're seeing so many players, to try and get through it in a quick manner. However, I think it's around having those larger MDT teams around what they're looking for, how they're looking for it, and really try and, similarly to what Ben said, going away on these camps. They come away and they're away from their parents. Some of them are away for the first time, even at 15, 16. So it's really trying to help them through that as a bit of a character sort of building and help them through it as much as possible. And also just having as many eyes as possible looking out for these things. So essentially we have a shared document across all of the staff. So the medical team may see something different to the coaching staff, who may see something different to the physical performance coach. It's essentially we have an online document at the younger age groups that we fill in on camp if you've noticed anything. So if you notice that somebody's looking a little bit withdrawn or a little bit lonely, then it's a case of trying to help them through that without it being too obvious that it's been noticed, and also trying to help peers in the right direction and really develop their leadership style to try and get them to help them, and because it's more powerful coming from their peers. But yeah, it's really sort of an assessment and eyes and a judgment of character and their communication style and how they communicate with us that we get the feedback from, and we try and focus around that as much as possible and individualize it. This only sort of really progresses further up the age groups when you really can start to know that person on a personal level as well as just a professional level. But we do sort of, the building blocks are there at a younger age group to try and help accelerate that.
Perfect. Thanks for joining us, Dan.
Thanks for having me.
we'll get to answer some of these audience questions in the final Q&A. So I'll pass back over to you, Tom, to introduce the next module.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Dan. Real insight into some of the processes and provision of analysis in our national teams. Thank you for your time. Real privilege to be able to welcome our next guest, a real friend of St Mary's and somebody who is involved in the initial planning of this programme. So I'll pass over to Senior Lecturer in Physical Education, Joanna Fonseca, to do so.
Thank you, Tom. Welcome, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are living. It's a really pleasure to see so many of you watching us this morning. So we have today we have a very, very dear to us guest. He has worked at St Mary's in the past, and once in a while we recruit him. The module that I'm involved in the master's degree is called Football Coaching Cultures, and is more related with the cultural aspects. I'm particularly interested as a researcher and as a coach developer. For 10 years I've been working with this area, where I'm particularly interested with how coaches develop their identity and how the social norms and the social rules actually influence their culture and the culture they live with. So this module is all about that, is to try to help students to investigate how values, beliefs and behaviors become normalized in their coaching cultures, and is almost like providing lenses, sociological lenses, to kind of give them self-awareness, give to our students self-awareness of what they are living. And once we get more an awareness of that, we are more able to act and to be, proactive towards those challenges and those complexities that we all face in the coaching culture. So I'm going to pass my this conversation to our amazing guest, Sam Page. Sam Page is under 11 and 12 head coach and a digital player development coach at Chelsea Football Club. He's also doing his PhD in Agile, supervised by Lee Nelson, and he has his topic of PhD is quite interesting, and it's something that we talk in our lectures, which is about how we manage the emotionality of the coaching, and he's going to talk more about that. Sam, give the word to you.
Morning, Joe. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Can you see that okay? Good news. Okay, fantastic. Well, good afternoon, everybody. And it is a real privilege to be asked to speak at this event, and some fantastic work continues to go on at St Mary's, and I'm really proud to say that at some point in my journey I was part of that. I'm going to talk to you today about my PhD research and the, I guess, early stages findings that are coming out of some of this work. It's important to say that I'm going through what we describe as an iterative process. So I've done a lot of data collection. I'm now going back in an iterative way, back between theory and data on a regular basis, and I'm starting to make sense of some of these things. It's an ongoing process. I'm still collecting more data, but these are some early findings. And I shared this presentation at an international conference a few months ago, and this is kind of the findings from that. Tom asked me to speak about it. Joe spoke about the lenses, and the lens that I'm going to talk about is actually symbolic interaction and actually identity theory specifically. So hopefully really closely relates to 7006, I think it is, coaching cultures. Initially really just to I suppose focus on why it's of interest, certainly from an applied perspective. As coaches, academy coaches, being an academy coach myself, having worked in academy football for a fairly significant amount of time, there is obviously an expectation in any form of coaching, whether it be performance or participation coaching, to have this sense of rationality, to make these really clear decisions about coaching. Level-headed is a really important thing, right? Like logical thinking. But equally, we're supposed to care a lot about the players and the responsibility we have to these players. And for me, that was a real dichotomy that I thought was a real significant interest to all coaches, really, not just from an academic perspective. I found it fascinating that you go on you go on courses, and having been through all of the FA courses up to level 4, I find it really interesting that we don't really talk about this very much. And I find it interesting that even going on degrees and having taught on coaching degrees, it's something which really it doesn't get spoken about a great deal. And I think it's a real nice addition to the program of 7006. Is this idea that we're supposed to be emotional, we're supposed to experience emotions, but we're never really given any guidance on how to deal with those, how to regulate, how to control. But of course, you've got to be emotional. So it's really important. Equally, I think this recognition of it being emotionally demanding is now really nicely spun off, and interestingly, with it being Mental Health Awareness Week, we've got to look after coaches' emotional well-being, and that's really important too. So it's clearly a really hot topic, and yet from a theoretical or certainly in sense of its theorization, we haven't really discussed it in the literature. So for me, really important. I'll just whiz through, I suppose, the background to it from a theoretical perspective. Back when I was doing my master's at the kind of early 2000s, some excellent work was done. And then, Joe, I know you worked a lot with Robin. You're very privileged to have worked with Robin. But around that kind of idea that coaching was much more than this bioscientific, rationalistic experience. It was something which was very social. And since then, we've kind of moved on, and researchers have gone, okay, so it's very social. But actually, what does that actually mean? So they've looked at almost these micro realities of coaching. And what's emerged is that coaching is an unbelievably political endeavor. Like, there are lots of organizational challenges that coaches face. There's lots of ethical dilemmas that coaches face. And equally, it's very emotional. But the lens wasn't really shone on emotions. And that's only really started to happen in the last few years, where particularly in community coaching, the work of, I suppose, well, initially PhDs from Ben Ives, Laura Gale, some of the forefront work by people that are on my supervisory team, Lee Nelson, Paul Pottrack, started to go, well, actually, yeah, community coaches, they experience emotions and they have to regulate emotions. They have to do these things. And some fantastic work has been done there. And what they've started to tell us, I guess, is that drawn to their identity? Because as coaches, we fully commit ourselves. It's you fully immerse yourself in the role of coaches, and I'm sure I'm speaking to lots of coaches out there who feel that. You feel your job day in, day out. You take it home with you, and yet we've never really experienced or investigated that from an academic perspective. This sense of identity and the emotions it caused. So it kind of led me to want to focus on this and draw this aim in my PhD research, is looking at performance coaching. In particular academy coaching, and try to collect and make sense of some empirical data about how emotions play an integral part of their day-to-day realities. I'll whiz through this bit because I want to show you some cool stuff in terms of the data, and a really nice story from one of the coaches I was working with. But I'm working in the interpretive paradigm, so I'm really interested in understanding the multiple realities that exist. I know those of you that are on or are thinking about taking the course, you'll go through the wonderful world of philosophy with the staff on the course, and look forward to that. But my PhD is located in the interpretive paradigm. I've spent time with 8 coaches over the last 15 to 18 months. It's, like I say, it's still ongoing. I've had some fantastic interactions with them. They've been telling me some wonderful stories. I feel very privileged to be part of it, going on the journey with them over that period of time. Been engaging in a kind of diary and interview fieldwork approach. So what that means is they will be sending me emotion diaries on a regular basis. There'll be audio or video diaries. They'll send them over to me, and then we follow that up with periodic interviews where we'll sit down and we'll kind of go through and really delve deeper into some of the stuff that's come out in the diaries. And I'll show you some of that data as we go through. And the data analysis is, like I said before, that iterative process where I'm going back between data and theory. I've not located it in the sense that I'm choosing one particular framework to go with. Equally, I'm not just kind of going with a grounded theory approach where I'm kind of taking the data first and then finding theories or creating theories associated with that. I'm kind of bouncing between the two in an iterative approach. Today, we're just going to talk about my first research question, which is the question you can see on the screen. It's really just looking at how we've got the experiences, what emotions have these coaches experienced over this time, and what's provoked those emotions, the kind of foundation for this. three key themes have emerged when we've been discussing about it, and the key thing which has been really vital is this idea around coaches' emotions are born a lot out of their identity verification. So that means whether their identity has been confirmed or disconfirmed, essentially. So whether they've actually, somebody's given them some behavior or some interaction which has made them think, well, actually I am a good coach, or actually no, you're not a very good coach. And that's led to a lot of the emotions that have emerged in relating to this particular theme. Interestingly, that's actually moved on, and we've also looked at how that verification doesn't just come in a dyadic sense. It's not just in one interaction with one person. That verification or confirmation of your sense of identity can sometimes come via a network, so several other different people. And also the other thing that's emerged is this notion of empathetic connections. In particular, that's looking at how we feel feelings for and on behalf of players. The main one I'm going to focus on is this idea around identity verification. The lens that, like Joe was talking about at the start, the lens that I'm using to look at this data and to try and make sense of it is symbolic interactionist theory. And that really nicely ties into identity theory specifically. Some of the foundations, just to help, I suppose, give a broad overview of what identity theory is within symbolic interactionism. It's this idea that we occupy specific positions and roles within organizations, of course, but not just within organizations, within groups, but also within individual encounters. This is a social encounter. It's a virtual social encounter. And within this social encounter, my role, presumably, is to be someone who knows something about this stuff. So I'm assuming a role, and that actually relates to my identity or my self-conception, my understanding around who I am. And this notion of around who we understand ourselves to be, this self-conception, is what drives our behavior, what drives our interactions with people. So what drives my interactions here is that I'm supposed to be talking like I know stuff about this kind of thing, and that's driving my behavior and how I'm managing myself in this situation. And essentially, the emotions that are created because people are either interacting with you in a way that confirms what you think about yourself, so your own self-conception, your identity, or it disconfirms it. And when that's the case, what you'll see identity confirmation results in positive emotion, and identity disconfirmation results in negative emotion. And there are loads of nuances around that, of course. But essentially, that's the crux of what we're going to look at in this particular piece. The example of the picture shows nicely that those young lads are clearly confirming that coach's identity by being really attentive, really focusing on what he's saying, all down on one knee, which is great, very uniform. There's a load of discipline there. It looks like they're confirming it. So that potentially would bear out really positive emotions in that coach, because they're confirming his identity as someone that they want to listen to and be led by. But what that confirmation and disconfirmation looks like, or is how it is understood by the coaches, is understood in this sense of cultural standards. So those cultural standards are, players will go in at half time, like the picture, and they'll get down on one knee and they'll listen, because that's a cultural standard within football. If one player were off going and doing their own thing, he would be breaking those cultural standards and potentially disconfirming that identity. The last thing really on this one, we'll cover it maybe in a bit more depth, is this idea around intensity of emotional response. And that's related to a couple of aspects, but particularly the regard that somebody is held. But we'll revisit that when we talk about the data shortly. I'm going to share with you a story of one of the coaches that I've worked with. Hopefully it's quite a nice story that paints a picture of some of these aspects. It's Graham. Obviously Graham is a pseudonym. Graham's a lead phase coach from Category 3 Academy. So he looks after the under 9s to under 11s, a bit like Ben did when he was talking us through some of the great work that Ben does with the foundation phase at the club I work. Graham has a split role, so he also takes the under 9s as well. A bit like Ben takes the 10s at Chelsea, Graham takes the under 9s at this particular Category 3 Academy. This example that I'm about to show you, this kind of excerpt from one of our conversations, is where Graham talks about how he brought in an external member, somebody from the national governing body, the FA, had come in, and he was the lead for the whole of that phase. So the foundation phase leads had come in and given him some positive feedback. And Graham discusses how that made him feel. So there's some nice things here in the sense that Graham gets a real sense of pride. He gets some real positive emotions from the fact that Tommy exchanged a private message with him to say, look, you're doing some really good work. In that sense, what Tommy was doing was he was confirming Graham's sense as a good coach. If Graham seeks this sense of personal identity as somebody who is a good coach, somebody who was a good lead phase coach, you're doing some really good work. So you're confirming your identity, and Graham felt some really positive emotions off the back of that. Whereas before, when he didn't have that, he was questioning himself and wondering ultimately what he was doing. And the important thing there is that intensity of emotions, that positive feeling that Graham experienced, was fairly intense and fairly significant because he holds Tommy in quite high regard. And the next part of the story, I suppose, that's worth mentioning is that Graham coaches the under-9s, and as part of Graham's role with coaching the under-9s, one of the players in the under-9s happens to be one of the first team's coaching staff's son. I don't know if I've explained that quite right, but so essentially it means that one of the first team coaching staff is present at nearly every training session that Graham leads because his son plays in that team. And what this creates a real sense of fear and trepidation in Graham because he's being quite heavily scrutinised, or he may not be, but it feels like he is because that particular significant other is there watching a lot of his training sessions, and it kind of has some impact on how that makes Graham feel. So the emotions we're talking about here are really strong emotions: fear, trepidation, worry about the fact that every session there could be the opportunity where one of the first team coaching staff, somebody that Graham holds in his network in really high regard, coming up to him and saying, shouldn't really have done it like that, or actually, that was really good, or doesn't come and say anything. And what does that mean if he doesn't come? He's coming to all these sessions and he's not saying anything to me. So that leads to a real sense of trepidation and fear. And we discussed that a lot over the period of time. And what that tells us is that the potential for disconfirmation, understanding from an identity theory perspective, the potential for disconfirmation, what that means is it leads to a situation where we've got this trepidation, this emotion of fear and trepidation, because at the moment there is no confirmation or disconfirmation. So even the prospect of confirming your identity, or the prospect of identity verification leads to emotions. But it works out quite nicely for Graham, as most stories have a nice ending, don't they? So what happens to Graham is, I suppose I'll let you read the piece and then we'll discuss. And I have to say, as a researcher, that, you know, having receiving this diary entry, and this was the first news I got of this situation. I've been working with Graham for a long period of time, and having lots of conversations about the circumstance, the worry, the fear, the trepidation. It was a fantastic journey to go with Graham on. Getting this diary entry through, it was an audio diary actually that he was recording on a car journey, and getting it through to me to say that, you know what, yes, fantastic. All this worry, all this work, I've been given this position, this opportunity to move up. I've been getting some really good feedback. It's been fantastic. It was really exciting and really great for me to see. And what was nice about it was that what we can see is that effectively that confirmation of Graham's identity for being a good coach, getting good feedback, getting the opportunity to what's seen as a promotion, certainly at the club that Graham works at. It was that confirmation of identity, and the confirmation of his own identity was what produced those really positive feelings and positive emotions. And again, the intensity of the emotion, the excitement in Graham's voice when he was telling me, when he was recording this audio diary entry, was fantastic, and it definitely reflected the regard, or the salience is the term that theorists would use, in relation to the person who was giving the feedback. So a very significant other in the network, really significant in the organisation, a first team member of staff is telling him he's doing a good job. He's telling him he's a good coach. And that leads to a really significant emotional or significantly intense emotional response. So I guess in terms of me, the thoughts and conclusions in terms of theory. Again, important to say that these are just some examples, and this is just the first stage or first cycle of my iterative analysis. And what that means is that this is the first reading of the data, trying to make sense of the data with theory. And the more I'm going to read about the theory, the more I'm going to read through my data, then certainly there'll be additions and there'll be more depth. But what we can tell from this first cycle is that there's definite utility in some of the work that's been done before that's used symbolic interactionist theory to help make sense of emotions. What we know now is that there's utility in using that beyond the participation grassroots context, actually really useful in a performance context too. And the fact that coaches hold their identity as a coach really dear to them. It is part of their lives. It's a really important part of who they believe they are. And that produces some really significant emotional responses when that identity is either potentially challenged. In the case of the story I just shared, it wasn't even challenged at any point. It was the potential for it being challenged that led to that fear and trepidation. But then the positive emotional response when it was confirmed, and yes, you're a good coach, have a promotion. The really strong sense of positive emotions that were experienced, and how the potential for this reflexive nature, I suppose, what they call the perceptual control loop, is the sense that in order to get positive feedback, in order to get that confirmation of identity as a good coach, I may well change the way I behave. I may well change the way I coach sometimes in order to get that feedback and to get that positive feeling. Sometimes I may not like it. And I'm sure we're talking to some people online here that may have changed the way they coach sometimes to get some good feedback, to get that sense of positivity. And again, probably we haven't really discussed these things across many spheres before. So for me, the things that I'm really interested in focus on in the next stages of my research are the significances of the network. The last thing, I guess, really is that Graham, he spoke to me about how he had become part of that network of people that were able to speak to the first team staff, that they went to a particular game and they went in a particular box at a first team game, and then at an FA Youth Cup game. And what was really interesting about that was that Graham really wrestled with that, because it was great to be part of that network now, that really significant network and powerful network at the club. But equally, he felt a responsibility to the network of people that he was also part of with the other academy staff. And the dilemmas he faced and the emotions that were born out of that are something that in the next stage of my analysis I'm definitely going to investigate. And finally, the multiple identities. So we've just talked about Graham's sense of identity as a coach, as a lead phase coach, as an under-9s coach, as a coach that's been working for 20 years. But we haven't even discussed Graham's role as a father, husband, brother, son, all of these different aspects as well. And I'm really interested in looking at how those things impact on our professional day-to-day identities, but also our personal identities as well. So I think that's me, Joan.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's really interesting, and as you probably know, this is kind of the area that I'm also very interested in. And I think we definitely, I'm gonna put some questions for you, and we can further discuss your project. But I think one of the things that really bring life to me in my work, I study identity in the sense of how can I improve the students to develop their identities, particularly students who are starting now and who don't have many years of experience, or they might be entering a new club where they have to accommodate and they have to seek for this confirmation of identity, and how can we help them to manage those emotions, and what you said, that sometimes we almost have to have different identities, not just personal identities, but also as a coach, different identities. And it is all about having an awareness of that, and having an awareness that I'm doing this because in this context, I first need to build trust, or in this context, I first need to put my feet in, and then slowly start to be more resilient to the known confirmation and try to put their feet into it and bring in their own personality. And I think that is something that, as you said, it's not really very discussed in coach development, and it's something that coaches need to have more awareness of. So I think because of the time we have to pass on, but I would incentivize all the attendees to please do all the questions. I'm going to be here, and Sam as well. We're going to try to answer all the questions online. Thank you very much, and I will pass back to Tom.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Sam. Sam, really appreciate that, and particularly the clarity in which you discuss some quite complex ideas. So thank you for your time. But as we sort of enter the sort of last two presentations for today, it's just, I suppose, really important. I suppose we move on to our independent project module, and the nature, I suppose, in relation to this for the next two is really exciting. And it's my hope that you too find these topics sort of as inspiring for future research as I do. So it's with a great pleasure to introduce Head of Department for Psychology and Pedagogic Science, Abby Brady.
Hi everyone, it's absolutely wonderful to be here. Thanks Tom and the team for organising this. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I'm going to share my screen just to introduce kind of the overview of the module. But I hope everyone can pick up the sense that out of all these presentations that you're hearing, there's projects after project after project, there's question and question and question that we need to explore further. And that's what this module does. So I'm going to share my screen and just show a little bit about what the module does. So hopefully people can see here, this module is, we call it the independent project. And really what it's about discovery and creating new knowledge. And what we love about it is that this isn't theory for theory's sake, even though theory is really important. This is about really addressing a real world problem. So when our students undertake a project, or this project, what they're doing is making a real difference. And that's why I have to say, as a supervisor of some of those projects, it's so inspiring and so motivating to see what the students are actually producing, be that investigating a mentoring project, be that looking at involving parents more, be that supporting coach knowledge or development. And it's that we're going to focus on today, but there are many questions we could associate with this module and many exciting projects that are the produce of it. So what does it do? So as well as just really focusing on a real world problem, it's about generating and discovering valuable insights, and where possible, adding to an existing body of knowledge. In some cases, the stuff that people do on these modules is actually very, very original. And that's absolutely a real bonus as well. So when someone's done the module and it was going through it, we require them to be able to plan, design, and then conduct a piece of research. And there's a lot of skills involved in this, not only in developing the skills to collect your data in whatever format that is, but also to analyse it. And there's many different ways to collect and many different ways to analyse. Now, it's not enough to do that. What's really important, and what you can see here in this webinar, is that it's crucial to be able to communicate your findings. It's not enough for them to be written up and left on a shelf somewhere. Communicating is vital. And so in this module, as well as communicating in a written format and producing a report, we require the students to present their work pretty much like we're doing today, and like you've seen Sam just do a little while ago. So when a project's been completed, I'd like to think, and I'm sure the team would support me in saying this, that there's been some meaningful discovery. I'm just looking at the bottom of this slide now, that the research has made a real difference to key stakeholders in football, whoever those may be. And that by doing so, by producing this knowledge, we're going to enhance football, be that knowledge and or practice in some meaningful way. So that's really what I'm going to say about the module now. And I'd really like to focus on the thing that most people want to see and hear about, and that's our wonderful guest today. And I'm going to introduce Amy Price. Amy's the National Women's Coach Development Officer for the Football Association. And we're very, very proud that she used to work with us. And that's probably one of the reasons we've got such a great connection with her. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Amy. But I'm going to kick off, first of all, by just asking Amy to tell us a little bit about what is coach development in the women's game, and what are some of the challenges that you're facing. Over to you, Amy.
Thanks, Abby, and thanks everyone for inviting me to speak today. So yeah, women's national coach developer for the FA. So there's 4 of us covering the country. So we take a quarter each, and it's a new role. So January 2019 was the first time the women's game ever had fully dedicated coach developers, which is obviously a huge deal and really exciting. Prior to our arrival, there was actually 9 coach development officers situated at various universities throughout the country, where universities collaborate with the FA to helped to implement some of the aims and objectives from our strategy, which is the game plan for growth, which started in 2017. And actually it's just finishing up now, that strategy. So I think there already has been some stuff out in the media in terms of reviewing the impact of that over those 4 years. So women's game coach development is probably quite different to coach development in the men's game in some ways, just due to how quickly the game is changing and evolving. So the Women's Super League is fully professional, and that's new. It's not been like that for a long time, 2 seasons. So as a result of that, coaches, managers, the multidisciplinary teams that operate within that environment, there's just different pressures that are facing them, which maybe they hadn't encountered before when these coaches were previously working in more of a part-time environment where maybe they were just training 2 times a week, 3 times a week, and then having a game. It's now, fully professional, full-time. You have the Women's Championship that sits beneath the WSL, which is still part-time, but some clubs operate on a hybrid where they offer optional training to players to try and make up a full-time program if it's needed or if it can happen. So yeah, that's kind of why the coach development side of it is quite unique from a women's game perspective, because there's obviously like a lot of skills and knowledge that these coaches are hungry for, that they probably need to develop quite quickly. You can think of the media attention now that's on some of the managers in the WSL Women's Championship, and how do you handle that if you've never faced that type of pressure before, when your results and your performances are talked about in the media, on the internet, and there's fans. That was part of the strategy to double the fan base, and clubs have done amazingly well with that. And the national team filling Wembley Stadium, like the FA Cup final filled the stadium. So it's just a different environment now. And so as a coach developer, it's just as much as their skill set is needing to develop quite quickly, ours is as well, because, we haven't necessarily worked with coaches who are under this amount of pressure. And it's not just the managers and the coaches, but down through the tiers of football. So we operate at Women's Super League, Women's Championship, National League, which is the top 3 leagues. But those clubs many of them have RTCs, regional talent centres, which is like the youth setups, the academies. And coaches, even in the academy levels, are now having to operate differently, like understanding sports science more, understanding performance analysis and psychology, and being able to work more effectively within a team. And that's like a really big thing that I feel if we can really help coaches with that, the impact upon player development will be massive. The other uniqueness of the women's game in terms of a coach development is obviously participation in the game isn't as high as boys, although it has, since the strategy started, it has doubled. But in the east and the west of the country, there aren't regional talent centres. So if you're a talented footballer growing up in Cornwall, you're actually playing in something called an advanced coaching centre, where they only train once a week. There's no games. So they're playing in grassroots football. So as a coach developer, it's like, how do we support the coach of that player, so the ACC coach, to design a bespoke program that will challenge that player? The games program, for example, in girls football is ever evolving, and there's so much scope for the games program to be utilised in a way that really stretches the exposure of players, especially in the east and west, but also all over the country. And there's just a lot of scope to improve and develop further all the stuff we've already got in place. And the other thing that's quite apparent is obviously in the men's game, where you have at the highest level big budgets to buy in players, it's not necessarily like that for all of the clubs in the women's game. So there's a real pressure on, how do I develop players, but also how do I win games? So it's trying to help the coaches to make sense of that in their head, and have these plans and to make that happen. What's really cool is that there isn't at the moment, and I hope it stays this way, but there isn't a hiring and firing approach towards coaches in the women and girls game. In general, it looks at the moment that like clubs are quite patient with the member of staff or the manager or the coaches that are doing the coaching, and we hope it stays that way, of course. And it's something where we're really important to that process because, you know, we want to, as I said, rapidly develop the coaching skills so that they can stay in that job for as long as possible. And women coaches are another really important factor. So how do we, as coach developers, we support every coach in the game? You know, it's not like we just support female coaches, we support every coach in the game. But also just being aware that where possible, are there opportunities for female coaches to progress? So there are opportunities that might not have been there before for women coaches. And just keeping an eye on that and being quite aware of how we can identify talent. So as you might, as a coach, you identify talent in terms of players, but for us, it's identifying talent and potential in terms of coaches. And as a team of coach developers, being aware of like, what does that look like? What attributes does a talented coach or a high potential coach display? Are we on the same page with that? And of course, in your context, coaching contexts are so different and the demands are so different from club to club. So sometimes how does the context influence whether those attributes are on display or not? So it's really important for us to get to know the coaches as people and understand the environment they're operating within, and also their background. How have they got to this point? What type of journey have they been on? What exposure have they had so far in the game in terms of coaching or playing?
Amy, it sounds fascinating. I think you've really articulated really well there just some of the unique challenges that the women's game are facing. And I don't know, for those that are listening, if you could imagine, if you're not presently in the public eye, if you could imagine within a year or two suddenly becoming everything you do being scrutinised. That's what some of the, by the sounds of what you're saying, Amy, that's what some of the coaches, particularly those in perhaps WSL and championships, are now facing, and you're trying to support those coaches manage that situation. So absolutely fascinating. Like, just thinking about time here, I want to move on, and you speak about supporting coaches, and I just wonder if you could share with us some of the ways you're supporting coaches now in lockdown, and what are some of the concerns that coaches are raising with you?
It's been a really exciting time, actually, lockdown with coach development, because actually for the first time about 2 weeks ago, I observed, I did like a in situ support visit over Zoom. So it was a youth team coach coaching his players on Zoom, and I was kind of in the background. And it was just the weirdest experience. I was like, wow, like number one, how hard it is to actually coach players remotely, actually seeing that in action. And then number two, how do you do coach development from that perspective? And it was just, it's opened up a whole new world for sure in terms of coach development and coaching. But I feel like generally the coaches have maintained really good levels of motivation and passion and enthusiasm during this time. It must be so hard, but you know, like as long as there's a thirst and a motivation from them towards us in terms of wanting to catch up one-to-one, wanting to talk about their planning for next season, or wanting to talk about their playing philosophy, and just having someone to talk that through with, you know, it's literally like just talking and listening and asking questions. And I think this period of time has allowed a lot of the coaches just to like slow down, catch their breath, because they're obviously like they're 100 miles an hour, most of them, working really hard, putting in a lot of effort and energy. So it's been a good time for some coaches probably to reflect on who they are as a coach, develop a greater awareness of who they are as a coach, because ultimately that's what's going to allow them to have the biggest impact on others, is if you can truly understand how you are as a person. So that's been some good time, some deep conversations, some fun conversations. We're also really lucky in the women's game that coaches are at that stage where they really do want to learn really quickly, and they're actually willing to have collaborative conversations. So competitors like coach from that club are actually coming together and talking about coaching and sharing what they've got so far and their ideas and what's worked and what hasn't worked. So we have quite a lot of community of practices like remotely. for different coaches to take part in, whether that's like technical directors at RTCs or it might be managers at clubs. Just talking about how it's going. It's a good support network for them. Yeah. It's not just myself or it's not just someone else. It's like they feel much more supported in that way, I think. We've had
Sorry, just on that note, I'm just aware of time. I was just wondering if you could sum up for us, what would you say are some of the three, and maybe in just a minute, what are some of the 2 or 3 of the key successes you've noticed in your short time in this role?
Key successes in this role so far. For me, it's really hard to measure success in coach development. Like obviously across the game, like where we have our coach development officers and women's national coach developers, there's like different goals and targets for us. So it might be numbers sometimes in terms of doubling the number of qualified coaches. But in most cases, with true coach development, it's really hard to sometimes identify. So we kind of look at more in terms of like how people's thought process have evolved, or how they change their thinking, their attitude towards something changes, or you see just really subtle changes of behaviour, which you think, wow, I wouldn't have seen that 6 months ago. And I think ultimately underpinning everything is the successes is when a coach is able to really articulate and express their understanding of themselves within everything, because obviously the context of coaching is so dynamic, it's so difficult sometimes to operate in. But for those coaches that can actually say, you know what, I've reflected on that and this is what I think, and it's because of this is who I am, and this is my values, this is how I think about stuff. So for me, it's hard to pinpoint exact like big things, but it's like accumulation of like lots of little things sometimes that determine success in coach development.
Well, I guess with the doubling participation numbers, the growth of the coach workforce, the professionalisation of the game, you're in really challenging sort of realm and period of time. So, Amy, I think unfortunately we're out of time, and there's so many things I want to ask you still. If people want to contact you, can they just contact you directly through Twitter if they want to find out a little bit more about what's happening in the women's game and particularly around coach development?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, could you just remind people of your Twitter handle?
So it's Amy Price _10.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy. And I'm going to pass back to Tom now. So thanks for all your time, Amy.
No worries. Thanks, Abby.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Abby. A real privilege to be able to listen to some insights into coach development in the women's game, both from a practical perspective and with staff whose research is also situated in this context. So thank you. As we move into our last presentation, it's often a feature of the game that can perhaps get overlooked and sort of downplayed. And as such, it's a great pleasure to introduce a staff member whose own research has certainly helped shine light on my own touchline behaviours. So please introduce lecturer in sports coaching, Stuart Carrington.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. I hope everyone can hear me okay. It's a real pleasure to be here today and a great privilege to be able to participate and contribute to this forum. As Tom said, I'm not going to speak for too long, but what I would like to kind of draw to people's attention is that it's often overlooked that when there's a football match that takes place, particularly the highest levels, there's actually 3 teams that are performing. And one of those teams has no interest, no matter what coaches or players might think sometimes in the overall result or the overall winner. They just want to make sure that the game is played as effectively as possible within the boundaries and laws of the game, and obviously ensure the safety of all participants as well. And their performance is so overlooked that historically the training that they receive is always behind the curve. And as Abby spoke about the benefits and the wonderful opportunity for the research project, an independent project that offers you, I would like to maybe try to whet your appetite into looking at that third team, which is of course the officials. So without further ado, it's with great pleasure that I get to introduce to you a former FIFA referee instructor and current CEO of Sports Officials UK, Janie Frampton. Over to you, Janie.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to deliver, particularly around refereeing, which is not always seen as the coolest part of football. But actually, I think it has so much potential for what you can explore in it. For most people who love football, watch football, spectator football, or go to matches, they look at the laws of the game as they know it and the interpretation and application of those laws. What they don't see is all the technical aspect behind that. So referees at the top level don't just come out on a field and that's it. The training that goes behind it, the analysis, is absolutely phenomenal. Not just on the areas you would expect, which is their physical fitness, are they able to keep up, their knowledge and laws of the game. They are measured on every single intricacy, including their competence to actually do the job and how we measure competence. So I want to share with you some of the areas that we've worked on in the past and see if that whets the appetite for people to think that actually refereeing is quite interesting. So when you look at refereeing at the top level, there's several cameras on them and the assistant referees alone to measure many, many different spheres of the game. So obviously we can measure how far they run, walk, the time stood still. At any given time in the game, this is ProZone that measures. ProZone can measure the distance from the ball at any given time, the distance in relation to the nearest attacking or defending player, and all of those things are measured. So as well as their physical fitness, we can measure their alertness, their awareness, their quickness to respond to a reverse in play or a quick break. And all of those things then are fed back to the referees on every single game. So there's not just a video analysis of the game where their technical points can be measured. There's the ProZone analysis that can deliver all of those things. And one thing that has been analysed hugely in recent years is the role of the assistant referee. So let's just remember they're two separate roles. The referee is a proactive approach. They have to think, what next? Where do I have to be next? And why do I need to be there? The assistant referee is a reactive role. So the assistant referee has to firstly be able to react quicker. They have to be able to move quicker. And when you look at some of the analysis that's been carried out by Leuven University in Belgium, by a professor of kinesiology, it is phenomenal. On one particular study, he found out that an assistant referee at the halfway line, when the ball was not in his active half of play, because he had his weight on the left side of his body, instead of centrally down his core or on his right, by the time that quick break happened, he had lost 8.78 meters in the distance he would have covered in the time it took to change the weight from his body from the left to move on the right. Now, as a complete geek, I find that phenomenal. That type of research, I think, is amazing because that shows the psychological and the physical side of the role in unison, about you thinking, acting, and then physically moving. So when we look at some of those studies, look around some of the other key areas around our conscious and our non-conscious decision making. So there's been a study at Tel Aviv University that says 93% of our gut reaction decisions are correct. Now, when you put that in scale, okay, I would worry about the other 7%, but when you're getting 93% correct by your gut reaction, that is a really good measurement of where we need to go going forward. So take that into consideration, and then you look at, before VAR came in our Premier League, our assistant referees were working on 97.3% correct decisions across the board. So that's way and above the gut reaction decisions, according to the scope of the research, and actually quite phenomenal when you look at it's a reactive decision they have to make, which is why I use them more of an example than the referees, which is a proactive approach. Some years ago, probably around 2010, I know Abby will be aware of this, we created a personal professional development degree at another university. And it was all because the League Managers Association said, nobody measures the competence of the referees. So how can we find a measurement to do that? So we created a work-based learning degree, and then we asked 15 of the Premier League referees to be the guinea pigs to trial it. Now, some of that research that came out was brilliant. So let's take Howard Webb, one of the top referees in the world for many years. We all know that he refereed the 2010 World Cup final. I sat down with Howard and took 10 examples of penalties for one club that he'd given and shouldn't have, or he should have given and didn't. Now, this was again where the psychology meets your physical reactions. Why was he getting those wrong when he is so experienced and for one club? So by the time we analysed it, we looked at his position, we looked at the players concerned, and actually he was focusing on the attacker's leg rather than the defender, because that attacker, in his non-conscious, had got a reputation for feigning to go down in the penalty area. But he didn't realise that was his non-conscious that was delivering that, because consciously he would not make biased decisions. But the non-conscious has got the better because he was then looking at the wrong thing. So then we have to look at how we eliminate that non-conscious so that the decision-making becomes far more objective. And that's what we end up doing a lot of studying on. If there was somebody with a 50-50 ball, 50-50 tackle, if one player had actually given you loads of rubbish during the game, your non-conscious decision-making may step in and give it to the other player just because your non-conscious says that this player has been a pain all game. And again, that's not a bias because it's a non-conscious, so we have to learn to manage that non-conscious. In the 2010 World Cup final, we all know that Howard Webb refereed the final. Holland versus Spain. Now, the only way that Holland could have beaten the tactics of Spain, because Howard had done all of his preparation. He had studied both teams. But how was he going to be able to manage that situation and manage it in a way that was according to the application of the laws of the game when one team came out and did not play to their normal tactics? So they played anti-football. So there was Howard's conscious plan all in place of how he was going to manage that game. And within 37 minutes into the game, his non-conscious stepped in, and you could almost see him physically rolling up his sleeves, throwing away his plan, and deciding to do it absolutely what he sees and how he sees it. Now that's again where your psychological and your physical meet and start to work in unison. The De Jong situation is a classic in that game. And I'm sure that Howard has been asked a million times, how did you not send him off? How are you going to send a player off in a World Cup final when you don't see whether there's a point of contact or not? There's two outcomes to that. One is it's a red card if contact is made. And the other one is a free kick, indirect free kick, and maybe a yellow card if there's no contact. So all of a sudden, if you don't see that point of contact, then you've got to actually look at how can that decision be made. So then you have to drill down, well, why didn't he see the point of contact? And it's not then just about positioning, it's why was he not in the right position? And this is where the research comes in about your positioning, your what next, how you actually gauge where you need to be next and why. And the research into that is absolutely amazing. So we look at those things, and then we look again at the performance breakdown that's attached to it. Excuse me a second. I think I'm going to run out of juice. My battery's decided it's not going to last. So when you look at that, and then you look at the performance breakdown, you could then have made a decision and you're not even sure whether it's the right decision. But you have to then park it. So you have to have strategies. How do we develop those strategies? The psychological side of that development is different for everyone. And it was interesting linking to earlier speakers where they talked about how people learn. It's how they learn, how they process information, as to why that coping strategy is going to be different for everyone. And I can see particular referees at the top level who I know really well. And I know when there's a contentious decision, whether they're still carrying that for the next 10, 15 minutes, because I see it in their body language. So when we look at the possible research areas into officiating, I think it's really important to look at what the role is, what skills does it entail. So for example, for the personal professional development degree we created, we had 5 key areas. One is the sociology. Who are the people? Why do they come into refereeing? What types of people? The psychology of those. And then we have to look at the technical and the tactical. We have to look at their fitness, and that applies differently to every sport. But in this case, the fitness was hugely important. Because as we know, referees through Prozone are measured that they run between 12 and 15 kilometres every game. And only ever 2 or 3 players every weekend, different players, may run equal to that amount or more. So why is that? Is it the distance they cover? Is it the speed they cover? Is it because of where they need to be? So all of these permutations keep coming in to how we develop our referees. And then one of the final modules we did was honesty, ethics and fair play. Because that is what we are about. We are the absolute guardians of the standards of football. And we don't get it right every time. But we do work really, really hard to make sure that we get it right. So I guess I hope I'm leaving you with a message that says there are so many different aspects of refereeing to explore, to examine deeper. And for me, that's what makes it interesting all the years that I've been involved in it.
Janie, thank you so much for that insight, and you've really sort of covered this really broad spectrum of all these areas of officiating, and that's what really attracts me to this industry or role, I should say, because it's not just the physiological or the psychological. There's management, there's leadership, there's personality aspects, and all these wonderful things you've covered. I know we've spoken many times before, Janie, and you share the passion that I have for this area, and I don't want to take up everyone's time because Janie, I could talk about a long time about this. I have one question for you, and it's one that I really struggle with the evidence. There's on the continent, referees frequently report that they do a lot of research, and you mentioned Howard Webb, they're doing his research on the Holland and Spain teams before that World Cup final. And particularly in Spain, there's a lot of emphasis on referees doing their homework and doing research, and it will improve the performance. Whereas in Britain, it's seen as, well, you do a little bit and it might help you with positioning. But if you know too much, that might swing you the other way, because then you might start to make assumptions based on what you think you saw rather than what you saw. Where do you stand on prior research and good or bad? I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
This is really down to the individuals again, because again, it's how you process information. And when you look at the psychology of it, some people are able to manipulate their non-conscious. They are able to make sure the non-conscious visits certain areas. So I know that I can do as much homework because I am a person that has to find out everything. So I know that I would rather do all of my homework, keep it in the toolbox at the back of my head. Then if I need it, it's there. But my non-conscious has learnt not to create a bias from that. And that is really difficult to do. It's just like your facial features. I could remember an assessor saying to me, lovely smile you have on your face, Janie, throughout the game, but try not to have that smile on your face when you're sending someone off. Because my non-conscious had got my set smile on my face. So I then had to consciously say to my non-conscious almost, yeah, smile on my face all the time, except when it's a red card, and then I have to non-consciously switch that smile off, even though I'd probably love to get rid of the player.
Thank you so much for answering. It's an area that I know we could talk about more and more, but unfortunately we've run out of time. But thank you so much for talking to us today, Janie. I really appreciate it. And I'll hand back over to Tom.
Pleasure, thank you.
Janie, Stuart, what a fascinating insight, and it definitely gets me thinking just as a coach, but also it's really inspiring to listen to so many different facets of officiating and potentially to motivate some of our students to begin to research some of these areas. So thanks very much. I'm really conscious about time, and I'll probably just move back to my initial point at the beginning, which was we probably planned for some 2 Q&As, but we also really wanted to allow our guest speakers to provide the depth and detail that I'm sure we were all fascinated to listen to. So what we will do is we'll just allow you guys to populate the Q&A box, and we'll leave the call running once you get to the stage where your answers obviously your questions obviously been answered. Then feel free to leave us. So it goes to say just a huge thank you to all of our guests who have contributed today, and a huge thanks to all of our staff members. A special thanks to you as the audience. Some excellent questions and engagement. Please take care and stay safe, and we look forward to welcoming you to another St Mary's event soon. If you'd like to hear about more information, then please feel free to follow us at St Mary's PFC, or go to our websites to listen or hear more about the other webinars that we have coming up. Thanks very much.